My parents treated me like a servant. 3 days before Christmas, my mother smirked and dropped a massive menu on my laptop. She told me my sister's elite friends were spending Christmas here, a party of 18 people, and I was expected to cook, clean, and bow to them all night. I just smiled. That night, I flew to Florida for a business trip. When they arrived and saw the empty kitchen, her face turned pale, but the real surprise was still to come. My name is Vanessa, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your true worth. It was exactly 3 days before Christmas, and the winter air outside our Boston estate was freezing. I was sitting at the massive marble island in the center of my parents' kitchen. The house itself was a sprawling colonial property that had been in our family for decades, projecting a carefully curated image of old money and untouchable success. I was deep into my work reviewing some complex acquisition documents for my holding company on my laptop. The financial models were intricate, requiring my full and undivided attention. Of course, my family had absolutely no idea that I owned a massive private equity firm. To them, my property management business was just a glorified housekeeping gig that they constantly mocked and belittled at every family gathering. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen suddenly swung open. My mother Barbara marched in wearing her perfectly tailored cashmere sweater and a string of expensive designer pearls. She did not even bother to say good morning or ask how I was doing. Instead, she walked briskly toward the island and slammed a thick stack of papers directly onto my open laptop keyboard. I blinked, pulling my hands back just in time to avoid getting my fingers caught under the heavy stack. I looked down at the 6 pages of meticulously typed instructions. It was a massive grocery list paired with a complex 18-person menu featuring a 5-course dinner. There were unreasonable demands for hand-rolled pasta, a specific brand of imported caviar that I would somehow have to source in the city, a beef Wellington that took hours of preparation, and a multi-tiered dessert presentation. I looked up at her, waiting for an explanation. Barbara offered a cold, satisfied smirk. "Your sister Brittany is hosting a very exclusive Christmas gathering this year," she announced, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension I had known my entire life. "Her elite friends are coming from out of town, and they are spending the holidays right here at the estate. That includes Harrison Caldwell." She paused to let the name sink in, tilting her chin up as if I should be trembling with reverence at the mere mention of him. Harrison Caldwell was a highly sought-after CEO in the private equity world. I knew the name very well, though certainly not for the reasons my mother thought. Harrison was known for his ruthless business acumen and his impeccable standards. Barbara crossed her arms and leaned against the granite counter, looking down at me as if I were a hired hand who had just tracked mud onto her pristine floors. "You are going to prepare this entire 5-course meal," she instructed, tapping her manicured fingernail against the top page of the menu. "And you will also deep clean the east and west guest wings by tomorrow morning. I want fresh linens on all the beds, dusted baseboards, spotless bathrooms, and perfect floral arrangements in every single room. During the dinner itself, you will act as the coat check and the server. Make sure you wear something plain and black. We want you blending into the background so you do not distract from your sister. Brittany needs everything to be absolutely flawless for Harrison." I stared at the extensive list, feeling a familiar wave of exhaustion wash over me. For my entire life, this was exactly how I was treated. While Brittany was groomed for high society, showered with praise, given a luxury car for her 16th birthday, and handed every luxury imaginable, I was the designated helper. I was the afterthought, the family disappointment, who had stubbornly refused to join my father's commercial real estate firm after college. I chose to build my own path, starting what they thought was a small property management company. They truly believed my quiet nature meant submission. They thought my silence meant I accepted my role as the family servant. I slowly slid the heavy menu off my laptop keyboard and set it neatly on the marble counter. I took a deep breath, maintaining my composure. "I am sorry, Mom," I said politely, keeping my tone perfectly even and calm. "But I cannot do that. I have an important business trip scheduled for this week, and I am flying out tonight. I simply do not have the time to cook for 18 people or clean the guest wings before I leave. A loud, mocking scoff echoed from the doorway. My father Thomas stepped into the kitchen, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He had clearly been listening from the hallway, waiting for his moment to intervene. A business trip. He repeated, his voice laced with pure venom and sarcasm. What kind of business trip does a maid take? Are you traveling to scrub toilets in another state? Do not make me laugh, Vanessa. Thomas walked over and stood right beside my mother, forming their usual united front of intimidation. They always did this, cornering me in rooms and using their combined presence to try and force me into submission. Cancel your little housekeeping gig, he demanded, pointing a rigid finger at my face. This family is doing something important. Brittany has finally managed to get Harrison Caldwell to accept an invitation to our home. Do you have any idea what that means for us? Do you understand the magnitude of this opportunity? I looked at my father, noticing the slight tremor in his hand, the new gray hairs at his temples, and the deep tension around his eyes. I knew exactly what it meant. What Thomas and Barbara desperately tried to hide from Boston high society was that my father's commercial real estate firm was secretly bleeding money. I knew this because I had seen their financial reports cross my desk a few weeks prior during a routine industry analysis. They were drowning in massive debt, severely over-leveraged on terrible investments, and mere weeks away from total bankruptcy. Their country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and designer clothes were all funded by credit they could no longer afford to maintain. Brittany, the golden child who had never worked a real day in her life, was their final desperate lifeline. She needed to secure Harrison Caldwell as both an investor to bail out my father's failing portfolio and as a husband to save their sinking social status. They needed this Christmas dinner to be an absolute illusion of extravagant wealth and domestic perfection. And they needed me to provide the free labor to pull it off, because they could not actually afford to hire a professional catering team or a luxury cleaning service anymore. They were entirely broke, living on borrowed time and borrowed money. I looked my father right in the eyes, refusing to break eye contact or show any weakness. My business trip is non-negotiable, I replied smoothly, closing my laptop screen halfway. You still have 3 days until Christmas. That is plenty of time to hire a professional catering service and a cleaning crew to handle the guest wings. If this dinner is so important to Brittany, she can organize the vendors herself. She has nothing else to do all day. My mother gasped dramatically, clutching her chest, as if I had just struck her across the face. You selfish, ungrateful child, she hissed, her eyes narrowing with intense rage. We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We paid for your upbringing. And this is how you repay us, when your own sister is trying to secure the future of this entire family. You refuse to do a few simple chores to help her. I am not a chore service, Mom, I responded calmly. I have my own life, my own career, and my own responsibilities. Thomas slammed his fist down hard on the marble island, making my coffee mug jump and rattle against the stone surface. Listen to me very carefully, Vanessa, he growled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he leaned over the counter toward me. If you do not do your part for this family, if you embarrass us by refusing to serve Brittany and Harrison on Christmas, I will cut you out of the family trust entirely. He paused, letting the threat hang in the heavy air of the kitchen, genuinely believing he had just played his ultimate trump card. You will not see a single dime of my money, he continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I will call the lawyers tomorrow morning and have your name completely erased from the estate documents. You will be left with nothing but your pathetic little cleaning business. You will be dead to us. Do you understand? They stood there side by side, glaring at me with absolute contempt. They fully expected me to crumble into tears and apologize. They thought the threat of losing their wealth would terrify me into immediate submission. They genuinely believed the family trust fund was my only safety net in the world, the only thing keeping me from living on the streets. They had absolutely no clue that the trust fund they were dangling over my head was pennies compared to what I made in a single quarter. They did not know that the private equity firm I built from the ground up, Apex Capital, was currently managing billions in assets. I could buy their entire failing real estate firm 10 times over, sell it for parts, and not even notice the tiny dent in my bank account. The irony of them threatening a self-made executive with a dwindling trust fund was almost too delicious to bear. I looked at the ridiculous 18-person menu sitting on the counter. Then I looked at my mother's furious, expectant face, and finally at my father's red, angry expression. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice, defend my career, or try to explain myself. I knew that explaining would be a massive waste of breath on people committed to misunderstanding me. I simply smiled. It was a calm, peaceful smile that seemed to confuse them for a brief second. The silence stretched between us as I reached out, gently closed my laptop all the way, and slipped it safely into my leather designer tote bag. I stood up from the bar stool, smoothing out my clothes, and looked at them one last time. "Understood," I said softly. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving my parents and sister standing there in their cloud of unearned arrogance. I did not look back. I climbed the grand curving staircase to my bedroom, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian carpet. My mind was completely clear. There was no hesitation, no guilt, and certainly no fear about my father's empty threats. In my room, I pulled my black leather weekender bag from the top shelf of my closet. It was a custom piece, understated but incredibly expensive, a gift to myself after closing my first $100 million acquisition. I packed with practiced efficiency: silk blouses, tailored linen trousers, a few elegant evening dresses, and my favorite pair of designer sunglasses. I did not pack an apron. I did not pack anything suitable for scrubbing guest bathrooms or serving caviar to my sister's pretentious friends. I checked my watch. My private aviation service had a car waiting for me at the end of the driveway. I zipped the bag closed, slipped into my cashmere trench coat, and walked back downstairs. The house was quiet now. I could hear the faint murmur of my mother's voice from her study, probably complaining to a friend about my supposed insubordination. I bypassed the front door to avoid the creaky floorboards in the foyer and slipped out through the side entrance. The freezing Boston wind hit my face instantly, but I welcomed the bite of the winter air. It felt crisp and waking. A sleek black town car was idling by the wrought iron gates. The driver, a professional who had driven me dozens of times for my actual business trips, immediately stepped out to open the door and take my bag. He did not ask questions. He just offered a polite nod and merged seamlessly into the afternoon traffic heading toward Logan International Airport. I leaned back against the plush leather seats and watched the snow-covered streets of Boston roll by. A genuine laugh escaped my lips. I could not help it. The sheer absurdity of the situation was too rich. My father, a man whose real estate empire was currently suffocating under a mountain of bad debt and poor management, had just threatened to cut me out of a trust fund that was practically worthless. They thought that trust was my entire universe. In their minds, I was a struggling property manager who scraped by on collecting rent checks from mid-tier apartment complexes. They assumed I desperately needed their financial safety net to survive. They did not know that my property management company was merely a shell, a quiet little LLC I had used in my early 20s to buy my very first distressed commercial asset. That tiny LLC had evolved. Over the past 10 years, I had quietly built Apex Capital from the ground up. I did not ask my father for seed money. I did not use the family name to open doors. I used sheer grit, razor-sharp financial instincts, and an absolute refusal to fail. Now, Apex Capital was a premier private equity firm specializing in luxury asset management and corporate restructuring. We bought failing companies, stripped out the toxic debt, replaced incompetent leadership, and turned them into highly profitable enterprises. I was not a maid. I was the executioner for dying businesses. We arrived at Logan Airport with plenty of time to spare. I bypassed the crowded holiday ticketing lines and walked directly to the expedited security lane. Within minutes, I was sitting in the exclusive first-class lounge, far away from the holiday chaos echoing through the main terminal. I ordered a sparkling water with a twist of lime, settled into a quiet leather wingback chair in the corner, and opened my laptop. The moment the screen glowed to life, the final lingering shadows of my family's toxicity vanished. I was no longer the disappointing middle child. I was the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Capital. I opened my encrypted email portal and downloaded the latest briefing files from my executive team. We were in the final stages of acquiring a massive tech portfolio, a deal that would effectively double the operational footprint of my firm. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from my lead acquisitions director confirming that my flight to Palm Beach was on schedule and that the Florida legal team was prepped for our morning strategy meeting. I replied with a quick confirmation. The warmth of Florida was calling my name, promising sunshine, ocean breezes, and a multi-million-dollar business deal that required my signature. Boarding the flight was seamless. The flight attendant greeted me by name and guided me to my first-class pod near the front of the cabin. I settled into the wide reclining seat, accepted a warm towel, and requested a glass of vintage champagne before takeoff. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the gray, snowy Boston sky, I looked out the window. I pictured my mother pacing the kitchen, my father boasting to his friends, and my sister meticulously planning her outfit to impress Harrison Caldwell. They were completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, I lowered my tray table and spread out the physical documents I had brought in my briefcase. Digital files were efficient, but I always preferred reading the final acquisition contracts on heavy, high-quality paper. There was something deeply satisfying about holding a company's entire financial future in my hands. I reviewed the balance sheets, running the numbers in my head. The tech portfolio we were buying was fundamentally strong, but suffered from catastrophic mismanagement. The previous owners had over-leveraged their assets, making foolish investments based on ego rather than market reality. It was a story I knew all too well. It was the exact same mistake my father was currently making with his real estate firm. Ego always blinded people to the math, and the math never lied. My job, my real job, was to step into the wreckage, clear away the rot, and rebuild the foundation. That was why I had recently hired a new chief executive officer to run the public-facing operations of this newly acquired tech portfolio. I needed a shark, someone who understood how to navigate elite corporate circles, charm investors, and execute my vision flawlessly while I remained the invisible architect behind the scenes. I took a sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, dry taste. I flipped to the final page of the executive summary. The signature line for the incoming CEO was already signed, the ink dark and bold, Harrison Caldwell. Yes, the very same Harrison Caldwell my sister was currently preparing to bat her eyelashes at. The very same CEO my father was hoping to corner by the fireplace on Christmas Eve to beg for a financial bailout. They thought Harrison was an independent billionaire coming to grace their home with his presence. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison worked for me. I signed his paychecks, I approved his operational budgets, I was his boss. I spent the next 3 hours of the flight completely immersed in the joy of my work. I highlighted discrepancies in the cash flow statements, noted structural changes I wanted to implement in the tech firm's hierarchy, and drafted an email to Harrison outlining our strategy for the upcoming quarter. I worked with the kind of intense, unbroken focus that my family claimed I completely lacked. As the plane began its descent into Palm Beach International Airport, the gray skies of Massachusetts were replaced by brilliant blue and the sparkling turquoise of the Atlantic Ocean. I closed my briefcase and packed my laptop away. The cabin pressure shifted and the flight attendant came by to collect my empty champagne flute. I felt incredibly light. For 34 years, I had allowed my family's expectations to weigh me down. I had absorbed their insults, deflected their demands, and kept my true identity a secret to avoid their inevitable jealousy and sabotage. But the threat to cut me out of their pathetic trust fund had snapped the final frayed thread tying me to their delusion. They wanted me to be a servant. They wanted me to clean their toilets and serve their hors d'oeuvres while they played pretend for my employee. They had dug their own grave with their arrogance and their cruelty. I was not going to stop them from falling in. In fact, I was going to hand them the shovel. The wheels of the plane touched down on the Florida runway with a smooth, heavy thud. I turned on my phone, watching the cellular signal connect. The screen immediately lit up with a barrage of notifications, but I ignored them. I did not care about the holiday menu or the guest room linens. I was in Palm Beach now. I had a multi-million-dollar empire to run an acquisition to finalize and a sunny balcony waiting for me at my penthouse. The Christmas dinner disaster unfolding back in Boston was no longer my problem. It was simply the opening act of their long overdue reckoning. The warm, salt-tinged breeze of Palm Beach washed over me the moment I stepped out of the airport terminal. My private driver was already waiting, standing at attention beside a gleaming silver Bentley. He took my single designer travel bag with a polite nod and opened the door. As I sank into the plush leather seat, the contrast between the freezing, hostile environment of my parents' Boston estate and this tropical paradise felt incredibly profound. I watched the palm trees sway against the brilliant blue sky as we drove toward my oceanfront penthouse. The ride was completely silent, a stark and beautiful departure from the constant demanding noise of my mother and sister. For the first time in 34 years, I felt entirely unburdened by the crushing weight of their impossible expectations. When I arrived at my building, the concierge greeted me by name, handing me my mail with a warm smile. I stepped into the private elevator and swiped my security card, ascending directly to the top floor. The doors opened into my sanctuary. The penthouse featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Atlantic Ocean. The space was decorated exactly to my taste, featuring minimalist modern furniture, rare artwork I had purchased at private auctions, and a massive climate-controlled wine cellar. This was the life I had built with my own two hands, entirely independent of my family's toxic shadow. I walked over to the cellar, selected a rare vintage Cabernet Sauvignon, and poured myself a generous glass. I slipped off my heels, walked barefoot across the heated marble floors, and stepped out onto the sprawling wraparound balcony. The sun was just beginning its slow, magnificent descent toward the horizon, casting a fiery golden hue over the water. I placed my phone on the glass coffee table, sat back in a plush lounge chair, and waited. At exactly 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the screen of my phone lit up. The silent rebellion had officially been discovered. I knew exactly what was happening 1,500 miles away. My parents and Brittany had just returned to the Boston estate from their indulgent pre-Christmas spa day. They were expecting to walk through the heavy front doors into a meticulously crafted winter wonderland. They fully anticipated the rich smell of roasting beef Wellington wafting from the kitchen, the gleam of freshly polished family silver on the dining table, and the sight of me rushing around in a plain black uniform, eager to serve them and their high society guests. Instead, they had walked into a pitch-black freezing house with absolutely nothing prepared. The first text message popped onto my screen. It was from my mother, Vanessa. "Where are you? The kitchen is completely dark. Did you forget to turn on the exterior lights?" I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. I did not respond. 2 minutes later, a second text arrived, this one lacking any polite pretense. "Vanessa, answer me immediately. Nothing is prepped. The caviar is not plated. Where did you put the truffles?" I smiled, listening to the gentle crash of the ocean waves below my balcony. The texts started coming in rapid fire, buzzing violently against the glass table. My father joined the group chat. "Vanessa, this is not funny. Get downstairs right now. Stop playing games." The guests arrive in exactly 2 hours. Then came the phone calls. The screen flashed with my mother's face, but I simply watched it ring until it rolled over to voicemail. A minute later, my father called. Then Brittany. I let every single one of them go straight to voicemail, savoring the peaceful silence of my Florida balcony. After 10 minutes of relentless calling, I tapped the screen and opened the first audio message. My mother's voice blasted through the phone speaker, shrill, frantic, and dripping with absolute panic. "Vanessa? Where in God's name are you?" she shrieked, her usual composed elite persona completely shattering. I just walked into the guest wing and the beds are completely stripped. There are no fresh towels, there are no floral arrangements, Harrison Caldwell will be standing in our foyer in less than 2 hours. Get your lazy, ungrateful body back to this house immediately, or I swear to God you will regret it for the rest of your natural life. You are ruining everything. Every angry, sharp word from Barbara used to strike absolute fear into my heart when I was a child. I used to scramble to fix whatever minor infraction had set her off, desperate to earn a tiny fraction of the approval she so freely gave to my golden child sister. Now, listening to her lose her mind over unmade beds and missing appetizers, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, settling sense of peace. I took another sip of wine. The vintage was excellent, rich, and full-bodied, a perfect pairing for the sweet taste of vindication. They had assumed I would simply bow my head and submit to their ridiculous demands. They had severely miscalculated. The next voicemail was from my sister. I tapped play and leaned back into my chair, looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean. Brittany was hysterically crying, her breath hitching in a full-blown panic attack. "You ruined my life!" she screamed into the receiver, her voice breaking. "You are doing this because you are a bitter, jealous loser. Harrison is going to walk in here and see a dark, empty house. We have no food. We have no staff. How am I supposed to explain this to a billionaire? CEO. What am I supposed to feed him? You are a pathetic, vindictive monster, and I hate you. You always ruin everything for me." In the background of Brittany's frantic, heaving sobs, I could hear my father roaring. Thomas was throwing things in the kitchen, completely losing his temper. The unmistakable sound of a heavy crystal glass shattering against the marble floor echoed loudly through the audio recording. "We cannot cook anything," Barbara screamed in the background, her voice raw with desperation. "The oven is completely cold. The refrigerators are entirely empty. Thomas, what are we going to do? Call a caterer. Call someone right now. We cannot let Harrison see us like this." My father's voice boomed back, laced with a terrifying realization that his entire social and financial standing was about to collapse. On Christmas Eve, he shouted, "Nobody is available on short notice on Christmas Eve. Every luxury catering company in Boston is booked solid. We have absolutely no options. We have to order takeout." I paused the recording and let out a genuine hearty laugh. The image forming in my mind was simply too perfect. Thomas and Barbara, who prided themselves on being the absolute pinnacle of Boston high society, were now frantically scrambling to order greasy takeout on Christmas Eve. They had invited one of the most powerful private equity executives in the country, hoping to dazzle him with a flawless illusion of generational wealth, impeccable taste, and domestic perfection. They desperately needed Harrison's investment to save their sinking commercial real estate firm from imminent bankruptcy. Brittany desperately needed to charm him to secure her own financial future. Instead, Harrison Caldwell would be walking into a chaotic freezing house with no staff, no five-course luxury meal, and hosts who were completely unhinged and sweating with panic. They would probably be forced to serve him lukewarm lo mein stale egg rolls or soggy pepperoni pizza on their fine bone china. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of that reality was enough to permanently destroy their social standing in those elite corporate circles. Harrison was a man of impeccable standards. He would see right through their desperate, frantic facade. They had wanted me to be their unpaid servant to facilitate their grand, pathetic deception. They wanted me to clean their toilets, cook their food, and stand invisibly by the wall while they played pretend for my employee. By simply removing myself from the equation, I had allowed their own toxic incompetence to destroy them. I did not have to lift a finger to sabotage their evening. I just had to step out of the way and let gravity do the work. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my father typed in all capital letters. "You are dead to us. I am calling the lawyers on Monday. You will never see a dime of the trust fund. Consider yourself disowned." I looked at the message, feeling an overwhelming wave of freedom wash over me. They were still clinging to the delusion that their money held any power over me. They were still trying to control a self-made executive with the threat of a dwindling bankrupt trust fund. It was incredibly sad, but mostly it was hilarious. I smiled, felt the warm Florida breeze brush against my skin, and calmly pressed the button to mute the entire family group chat. I set the phone face down on the glass table, picked up my wine, and watched the sun dip below the beautiful horizon. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving the Florida sky painted in shades of deep violet and charcoal. I slept that night with the balcony doors open, letting the sound of the ocean lull me into the most restful sleep I had experienced in decades. Waking up on Christmas morning without the smell of burning stress and the sound of my mother shouting orders was a gift money simply could not buy. I spent the holiday exactly as I pleased. I swam in the warm ocean, ordered a magnificent brunch from my private chef, and reviewed international market trends. It was absolute perfection. But while I was enjoying my tropical sanctuary, a massive shockwave of humiliation was ripping through the Boston estate. I kept my personal phone muted, but my secure corporate network allowed me to keep a very passive eye on the fallout. It turned out the dinner with Harrison Caldwell was an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. From what I gathered through the furious voicemails my father left on my secondary phone line, Harrison had arrived exactly on time, expecting the refined old money elegance my family constantly bragged about. Instead, he walked into a freezing house reeking of panic. My parents had failed to secure a luxury caterer and had scrambled to order food from a local restaurant that was completely unequipped for high-end dining. My father tried to salvage the night by pouring his most expensive scotch, while Brittany practically threw herself at Harrison in a desperate attempt to secure his affection and his wallet. Harrison is a man who built his career on reading people and identifying liabilities. He saw right through their pathetic facade immediately. According to the furious rants my sister posted on her private social media accounts, which my security team monitors for potential corporate risks, Harrison stayed for exactly 45 minutes before politely excusing himself. He cited an urgent business call. He did not eat their food. He did not discuss real estate investments. He certainly did not look at Brittany twice. The rejection shattered their fragile egos. In their delusional minds, the failure was not due to their own incompetence, their staggering debt, or their complete lack of genuine charm. It was entirely my fault. If I had just stayed and played the obedient maid, Harrison would have handed them millions. That was the lie they told themselves to survive the humiliation. Because they could not punish me in person, my father and sister vowed to utterly destroy my life from afar. They decided to launch a coordinated, ruthless counterattack against what they believed was my sole source of income. Thomas sat in his home office the day after Christmas and began making phone calls. Believing I was just a low-level estate manager running a tiny local operation, he leveraged his remaining industry connections in the Boston commercial real estate sector. He intended to get me blacklisted from every local vendor, contractor, and client in the city. He called plumbing companies, landscaping businesses, and electrical contractors, spinning a fabricated tale about how I was a fraudulent, unreliable property manager who routinely skipped out on paying invoices. He warned them that doing business with Vanessa meant risking their own financial ruin. It was a remarkably petty and small-minded sabotage attempt. It was also completely hilarious. I found out about his little crusade because several of these local vendors actually forwarded his voicemails to my corporate legal department. They were totally bewildered. Apex Capital does not use local residential plumbers or neighborhood landscaping crews. We hire massive national corporate contracting firms to manage skyscrapers, luxury resorts, and industrial tech parks. My father was trying to burn down a lemonade stand while I was operating a global beverage conglomerate. His attempts to blacklist me were like throwing a single pebble at a battleship. The vendors he called had absolutely no idea who I was, because my name was insulated behind layers of corporate holding companies. They just thought Thomas was losing his mind. When the blacklisting campaign failed to produce any immediate tears or apologies from me, Thomas escalated his tactics. His desperation to assert control over my life drove him to commit actual federal crimes. He decided that since I had ruined their Christmas dinner, I legally owed them financial compensation for the catastrophic evening. He convinced himself that I was responsible for the emergency caterer they had tried and failed to hire, and the subsequent loss of Harrison Caldwell as an investor. He wanted to force me to pay for their failure. 2 days after Christmas, my secure corporate phone rang. It was David, my chief information security officer at Apex Capital. He did not sound alarmed, just mildly amused. He informed me that someone was actively trying to breach my primary personal banking portal. My father had used my old childhood address, my social security number, and the answers to my basic security questions to try and bypass the bank verification protocols. He knew the name of my first pet, the street I grew up on, and my mother's maiden name. Thomas was impersonating me on the phone with a customer service representative, aggressively demanding that a wire transfer of $30,000 be authorized immediately to cover unpaid family expenses. He yelled at the bank representative, claiming that he was managing my accounts while I was incapacitated, and that the funds needed to be released to his commercial real estate firm right away. He thought he was being incredibly clever, using his booming authoritative voice to bully a call center employee into breaking protocol. He assumed my personal finances were sitting in a standard checking account completely unprotected and ripe for the taking. He had no idea that my personal accounts were heavily fortified and directly linked to the institutional banking division of one of the largest financial groups in the world. My assets were monitored 24 hours a day by a dedicated team of wealth managers and automated fraud detection algorithms. The moment Thomas tried to initiate a wire transfer using an IP address located in Massachusetts, while my secure devices were pinging from Florida, the system locked down completely. David asked if I wanted the security team to involve federal authorities. A part of me considered it. It would have been incredibly easy to send the FBI to the Boston estate and have Thomas arrested for wire fraud and identity theft. It would have been the ultimate swift revenge. But I told David to hold off. Sending my father to prison would be too quick, too simple. It would give him an excuse to play the victim and blame his impending bankruptcy on legal troubles, rather than his own glaring incompetence. I wanted him to face the natural consequences of his terrible business decisions. I wanted him to watch his empire crumble because he was a failure, not because he was a martyr. Instead, I instructed David to let the bank handle it through their standard fraud prevention channels. The bank immediately flagged Thomas' phone number and IP address, locking him out of the system permanently. They sent a formal automated notice of fraudulent activity to his business email, warning him that any further attempts to access the account would result in severe legal action. The automated slap on the wrist was far more insulting to a man with a massive ego than a dramatic confrontation. It completely stripped him of his power and treated him like a common cybercriminal. I sat on my balcony in Palm Beach sipping a fresh espresso and listening to the ocean waves crash against the shore. I imagined my father sitting in his dark mahogany office, staring at the fraud warning on his computer screen, his face purple with rage. He had tried to crush my career and steal my money, and he had failed spectacularly at both. His counterattack was completely impotent. He was swinging wildly in the dark, trying to hit a target he could not even see. Brittany was not handling the failure any better. With Harrison Caldwell ghosting her messages and my father screaming at his computer monitor, she needed a way to vent her massive frustration. She could not attack me financially, so she decided to attack my character publicly. She wanted to punish me for denying her the perfect holiday aesthetic she felt she was owed. She wanted the world to know that I was the villain who had single-handedly ruined her chance at securing a billionaire husband. I opened my laptop and pulled up the detailed reports my security team had compiled regarding her online activity. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation and manufactured victimhood. My family was pulling out all the stops to destroy me, but they were fundamentally unequipped for the war they had just started. They thought they were fighting a helpless maid, but they were actually declaring war on a titan. And I was more than ready to watch them completely destroy themselves. Brittany had always wielded her social media presence like a perfectly manicured weapon. While our father favored aggressive, loud intimidation tactics, my sister preferred the insidious poison of public perception. With her follower count heavily padded by purchased bots and fellow trust fund kids from the Boston elite, Her Instagram and Facebook pages were carefully curated galleries of false perfection. When Harrison Caldwell stopped returning her desperate text messages, her perfectly filtered world began to crack. She needed a scapegoat to explain her sudden social failure, and naturally she chose the sister who had just refused to serve her. Sitting on my sun-drenched balcony with a fresh espresso, I opened the digital dossier my security team updated hourly. Brittany had launched a calculated passive-aggressive smear campaign that was almost impressive in its sheer delusion. She started with a series of text-based story posts using muted, somber background colors to convey a sense of deep, manufactured grief. The first post was a lengthy paragraph about the meaning of family loyalty during the holidays. She wrote about how devastating it was when the people you love most choose to abandon their responsibilities and leave their family stranded on Christmas Eve. She spun a tragic tale of a festive dinner ruined by a selfish, erratic sibling who simply walked out the door without a word, forcing her aging parents to suffer through the holidays in distress. She never used my name directly. She did not have to. Everyone in her pretentious social circle knew exactly who the disappointing older sister was. Brittany was painting a picture of me as a bitter, jealous freeloader who had finally snapped under the weight of my own inadequacy. The next phase of her digital assault escalated from vague disappointment to outright character assassination. She posted a photo of herself looking mournfully out a frosted window holding a cup of tea with both hands. The caption was a masterclass in toxic, weaponized victimhood. "It is so incredibly painful to watch someone you grew up with lose their grip on reality," she wrote. Mental health is a serious battle, but when a family member refuses to get help and instead lashes out with vindictive, unstable behavior, you have to set boundaries to protect your peace. We have given her everything: free housing, financial support, endless second chances. But you cannot save someone who insists on destroying every good thing our family builds. Please pray for my sister. We just hope she finds the help she so desperately needs before she burns every bridge she has left. The sheer audacity of the post was staggering. She was publicly framing me as a mentally unstable charity case who sponged off our parents' generosity. She was telling the world that I lived rent-free in their home and refused to work, completely ignoring the fact that I had moved out 12 years ago and had not accepted a single cent from Thomas or Barbara since the day I left for college. She was projecting her own exact financial reality onto me. Brittany was the one living rent-free. Brittany was the one maxing out credit cards our father could no longer afford to pay. But in the court of public opinion, whoever tells the story first usually controls the narrative. I scrolled through the comment section beneath her photo. It was a digital echo chamber of privileged ignorance. Wives of commercial real estate developers, daughters of venture capitalists, and various country club acquaintances flooded the post with sympathy. They left prayer hand emojis and long, supportive paragraphs praising Brittany for her strength and grace during such a difficult family crisis. They condemned my supposed erratic behavior, validating the fiction my sister had spun out of thin air. One particularly vocal family friend commented about how I had always seemed a little unbalanced and jealous of Brittany's natural beauty and success. Brittany replied to that comment with a single sad heart emoji, perfectly playing the role of the wounded, forgiving angel. But she did not stop there. The desperation to explain away the disastrous Christmas dinner pushed her to fabricate even more severe accusations. The following afternoon, she posted a lengthy video on her page, sitting in her plush bedroom with perfectly styled hair and barely there makeup designed to make her look exhausted and fragile. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. She claimed that before I had stormed out and abandoned the family, I had stolen vital resources from our parents. She vaguely referenced missing funds and damaged property, implying that I had deliberately sabotaged their holiday out of pure, unadulterated spite. She spun a story where I had taken advantage of our father's generosity, draining family accounts to fund my sudden, erratic disappearance. She warned her followers to be careful about who they trusted, even if they shared the same blood. The irony was so thick I could practically choke on it. My father had literally just attempted to commit federal wire fraud by impersonating me to steal $30,000 from my personal bank accounts. Yet here was my sister broadcasting to thousands of people that I was the thief. They were coordinating their lies across multiple fronts. Thomas handled the corporate and financial sabotage attempts in the shadows, while Brittany managed the public relations campaign in the spotlight. Together, they were building an impenetrable fortress of lies, entirely convinced that I had absolutely no platform or power to defend myself. They assumed my silence meant I was defeated. They thought I was hiding in some cheap motel crying over my ruined reputation and panicking over my lack of a trust fund. They believed that because I did not immediately jump onto social media to scream and defend myself, their smear campaign was working flawlessly. My chief information security officer, David, called me later that afternoon to discuss the escalating situation. The social media analytics showed that Brittany's posts were gaining significant traction within the Boston elite networks. Several prominent families were sharing her video whispering about the dramatic downfall of the eldest daughter. "We can issue a cease and desist immediately." David suggested, his tone strictly professional but tinged with genuine annoyance on my behalf. "Her claims constitute blatant defamation and libel. We have the financial records to prove her statements regarding your housing and financial dependence are entirely false. A single letter from our legal department on Apex Capital letterhead would terrify her into deleting the entire account. We could also easily initiate a civil suit for damages to your character." I walked back into my penthouse living room, sinking into the plush white sofa. I looked at the digital dossier open on my laptop screen, reading through the hateful comments and Brittany's pathetic attention-seeking replies. A cease and desist would certainly stop her in her tracks. It would instantly shatter her illusion and force her to realize she was playing a very dangerous game with a corporate entity that could legally bury her before lunch. But stopping her now would be a massive waste of potential. Giving her a warning would allow her to retreat, delete the evidence, and play the victim all over again, claiming I was using expensive lawyers to bully her into silence. I did not want to silence my sister. I wanted her to speak as loudly as possible. I wanted her to shout her lies from the absolute highest digital rooftops she could find. "Do not send the cease and desist," I instructed David, closing the dossier on my screen. "Do not engage with her accounts in any way. I want you to meticulously archive every single post, every video, every comment, and every reply she makes. Back up the metadata and store it on the secure servers. Let her keep posting. Let her dig this hole as deep as she possibly can." David paused for a brief second before replying. "Understood. We will continue comprehensive monitoring and archiving. Should we prepare a counter-narrative for your personal channels just in case?" "No," I said smoothly. "I do not need a counter-narrative on social media. I am going to let reality do the talking when the time is right. Just keep watching the perimeter." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the sofa cushion. The strategy was incredibly simple. The higher Brittany built her pedestal of lies, the more devastating her inevitable fall would be. She was currently painting herself as the ultimate victim, a saintly daughter suffering under the burden of a mentally unstable thieving sister. She was gathering the sympathy of the entire Boston social elite, drawing all their eyes directly to our family dynamic. She wanted an audience. She craved the attention. And I was going to make absolutely certain she had the biggest audience possible when the truth finally dropped. Every lie she typed, every fake tear she shed on camera was just adding more fuel to the explosive payload I was quietly assembling. I did not need to defend my character to the wives of commercial real estate developers in an Instagram comment section. My character was forged in boardrooms validated by billion-dollar acquisitions and respected by the very titans of industry my family was currently begging for table scraps. Brittany thought she was destroying my reputation, but she was actually destroying her own credibility. She was setting a trap for me and walking right into it herself. The contrast between her frantic digital screaming and my absolute serene silence was the ultimate power play. I was untouchable. I was sitting at the absolute pinnacle of my industry, watching ants squabble over crumbs in the dirt below. And as the days rolled into January, the trap they had built for themselves was about to snap shut with bone-crushing force. My family spent the entire month of January operating under the massive delusion that they were destroying my life. Every day brought a new, pathetic attempt at sabotage. My security team flagged that Thomas had tried to cancel what he thought was my auto insurance policy, using outdated vehicle information from 10 years ago. Brittany spent hours creating fake email accounts to send terrible reviews to a generic property management firm in Boston that she mistakenly believed I owned. They were throwing rocks at a fortress that did not exist, completely unaware that I was standing on top of a mountain they could not even see. Their absolute failure to understand my tax bracket was the most entertaining part of their pathetic revenge tour. They thought I was a struggling middle-class worker desperately clinging to the fringes of their high society world. They had absolutely no concept of the invisible, impenetrable barrier that separated their dwindling millions from my expanding billions. When you reach a certain level of wealth, your identity is not tied to a single bank account or a public social media profile. Your existence becomes an interlocking web of holding companies' blind trusts and legal firewalls designed specifically to protect your assets from the exact kind of petty attacks my family was attempting. While Thomas and Barbara were stressing over late credit card payments and dodging calls from furious creditors, I was sitting in a climate-controlled, soundproof boardroom in downtown Palm Beach. The room featured a massive mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the marina. I was not worried about a fake Yelp review. I was focused entirely on a stack of heavily redacted contracts sitting precisely in the center of the table. This was the culmination of 6 months of intense negotiation. Apex Capital was officially acquiring a massive globally recognized tech portfolio. The portfolio included several cutting-edge software development firms, a sprawling data center network, and a highly profitable cybersecurity division. The current owners had fundamentally mismanaged the operational hierarchy, causing the stock valuation to plummet despite the incredible value of their core technology. It was a classic corporate distress scenario, and it was exactly the kind of mess I specialized in cleaning up. My legal team, composed of 5 brilliant corporate attorneys, sat around the table finalizing the last few clauses of the purchase agreement. The atmosphere in the room was electric, but perfectly controlled. This was not my first billion-dollar acquisition, but it was certainly one of the most complex. I sipped my espresso, running my eyes over the final payout structures. Everything was perfect. The numbers were airtight, the liabilities were securely compartmentalized, and the operational transition plan was flawless. I signed my name on the final line of the master contract, the scratch of my fountain pen loud in the quiet room. A collective exhale swept through my legal team. The deal was officially closed. Apex Capital had just executed one of the largest private tech acquisitions of the quarter. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling a deep, resonant satisfaction. This was real power. This was not the fake, fragile power my family desperately clung to through country club memberships and designer clothes. This was the ability to reshape entire industries with a single signature. With the acquisition complete, it was time to finalize the leadership transition. As the founder and invisible architect of Apex Capital, I never took public credit for these buyouts. My name did not appear in press releases or on corporate websites. I preferred the absolute freedom of anonymity. To maintain that freedom, I needed a public-facing figurehead, a sharp, charismatic shark who could stand in the spotlight, manage the board of directors, and execute my vision while taking all the public scrutiny. The door to the boardroom opened and my executive assistant stepped in. "He has arrived, Ms. Preston," she announced quietly. I nodded, standing up to smooth the lines of my tailored suit. "Send him in." A moment later, the man who would be the public face of this massive new tech empire walked through the door. He wore a perfectly cut charcoal suit and carried himself with an effortless, commanding authority. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his sharp, intelligent eyes immediately scanned the room before locking onto mine. He exuded an aura of absolute confidence, the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you are the smartest person in the room. It was Harrison Caldwell. Yes. The very same Harrison Caldwell my sister Brittany had been relentlessly stalking for the past 6 months. The very same CEO my father Thomas had desperately tried to corner on Christmas Eve to beg for a financial bailout. They thought Harrison was an independent, untouchable billionaire who held the key to saving their sinking commercial real estate firm. They had spent weeks agonizing over how to impress him, planning elaborate dinners and buying expensive outfits just for the chance to breathe the same air as him. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison was my employee. I had personally headhunted Harrison 3 months ago. I had been watching his career trajectory closely. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had a proven track record of turning failing tech startups into highly profitable unicorns. He was exactly the kind of weapon I needed to deploy for this new acquisition. I had approached him through several layers of corporate intermediaries, making him an offer he simply could not refuse. The compensation package included a massive base salary, significant stock options, and complete operational control over the newly acquired portfolio, provided he answered directly to me. He had accepted the offer immediately, recognizing the unprecedented scale of the opportunity. Harrison was a shark, but he was a shark who knew exactly who owned the ocean. "Good morning, Harrison," I said, extending my hand. "Good morning, boss," he replied smoothly, taking my hand with a firm, respectful grip. "Congratulations on the closing. The numbers look incredible." I gestured for him to take a seat at the table. My legal team quietly packed up their documents and exited the boardroom, leaving Harrison and me alone to discuss the transition strategy. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder containing his preliminary restructuring plans. He was prepared sharp and entirely focused on the business at hand. "I reviewed your initial proposals for the cybersecurity division," I said, leaning forward. "Your plan to streamline the management hierarchy is solid, but I want to aggressively push the expansion into the European markets much faster than you outlined. We have the capital to absorb the initial overhead, and I want to establish dominance before the competitors can pivot." Harrison nodded, taking notes in the margins of his proposal. "Understood. I will adjust the timeline and have the European expansion strategy accelerated. I have already begun headhunting regional directors who can hit the ground running." We spent the next 2 hours diving deep into the operational specifics. It was a high-level, fast-paced conversation that required absolute precision. This was the world I lived in, a world of strategic acquisitions, aggressive market expansion, and billion-dollar stakes. It was a world my family could not even begin to comprehend, let alone participate in. As we were wrapping up the meeting, Harrison closed his folder and looked at me, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. By the way, he said, his tone shifting from strictly professional to mildly amused. "I received another frantic email from your father's commercial real estate firm this morning. Thomas Preston. He is practically begging for a meeting to discuss a buyout." I paused, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly is he proposing?" Harrison chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "It is a disaster. He is trying to offload a portfolio of highly over-leveraged commercial properties in Boston. The debt-to-equity ratio is completely toxic. He is trying to dress up a sinking ship and sell it as a luxury cruise liner. The man is clearly desperate. His latest proposal included a heavily implied offer to set me up with his daughter. Brittany, I believe her name is. She has been blowing up my phone for weeks." I let out a slow, controlled breath, managing to suppress the laugh bubbling up in my throat. The absolute sheer irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. My father was currently spending his days trying to ruin my life by calling local plumbers and complaining to the bank while simultaneously begging my employee for a financial bailout. My sister was online calling me a mentally unstable freeloader while desperately trying to sleep her way into the very corporate structure I owned. They were completely, utterly trapped in a web of their own making, and they did not even know the spider was watching them struggle. "What is your assessment of the portfolio?" I asked, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. Harrison shook his head dismissively. It is garbage. The properties require massive capital injection just to meet current safety codes, and the commercial leasing market in that specific Boston sector is currently experiencing a massive downturn. Acquiring his firm would be a total liability. I was planning to send an automated rejection letter this afternoon. I looked out the window at the sparkling Palm Beach marina, a brilliant, devastating plan forming in my mind. The opportunity to execute the ultimate crushing reality check had just presented itself on a silver platter. I could not just let Harrison send an automated rejection. That would be far too easy. That would allow Thomas to simply move on to the next victim, spinning a new lie about why the deal fell through. I needed to dismantle his arrogance completely surgically and in person. I needed him to look his failure right in the eyes. Hold the rejection letter, I instructed, turning back to Harrison. He looked surprised. You want to consider the acquisition? It is a terrible investment, boss. I know it is, I replied smoothly. But I want to deliver the rejection myself. Harrison studied my face for a moment, his sharp eyes picking up on the subtle shift in my tone. He did not know the details of my family dynamic. He only knew me as Vanessa, the brilliant, ruthless founder of Apex Capital. He did not know that Thomas Preston was my father, or that Brittany was my sister. He just knew them as desperate, annoying business prospects, but he was smart enough to recognize a strategic play when he saw one. Understood, he said, simply closing his briefcase. How do you want to handle it? Tell Thomas Preston that you have reviewed his proposal and that you are interested in a final face-to-face meeting to discuss the terms of the acquisition. I instructed the plan, solidifying into absolute perfection. Tell him the meeting will take place in Boston, at a location of his choosing. Tell him the head of your acquisition board will be present to review the final numbers. Harrison nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. He recognized the tone of a predator circling its prey. I will make the arrangements immediately. As Harrison walked out of the boardroom, I picked up my phone and unlocked it. I opened the family group chat, which had been muted for nearly a month. The last message was still my father's ridiculous threat about the trust fund. I stared at the screen, a cold, serene focus settling over me. They wanted me to be the help. They wanted me to clean their messes, serve their food, and stand quietly in the background while they played at being important. They wanted to punish me for refusing to submit to their delusion. They were about to get exactly what they asked for. I was going to clean up their mess permanently. Late January arrived in Boston with a punishing, relentless cold that perfectly mirrored the freezing, harsh reality closing in on my father. While I remained comfortably in the sunlit sanctuary of my Florida penthouse, successfully executing global acquisitions and rapidly expanding my corporate footprint, Thomas was slowly suffocating under the crushing weight of his own colossal arrogance. The detailed reports crossing my secure desk painted a vivid picture of absolute financial devastation. His commercial real estate firm was not just struggling, it was actively gasping in its death throes. The toxic debt he had mindlessly accumulated over the past decade had finally triggered severe, unmanageable margin calls from his primary lenders. 3 of his major commercial properties in the historic downtown district were sitting entirely vacant, bleeding precious capital through massive property taxes and exorbitant maintenance fees that he simply could not afford to pay anymore. I sat in my home office sipping a dark roast coffee and scrolling through the internal audits Harrison had forwarded to my secure server. Thomas had officially drained his liquid cash reserves. The family trust fund he had so proudly threatened to cut me out of was completely empty, cannibalized to pay off aggressive creditors who were threatening to seize the Boston estate. The manicured lawns, the imported luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes they flaunted so arrogantly were all built on a massive, crumbling foundation of lies. My father was a fraud, playing a very dangerous game of financial roulette, and his luck had officially run out. Bankruptcy was no longer a vague threat looming in the distant future. It was a concrete, unavoidable reality scheduled to destroy his life in a matter of weeks. His absolute last desperate lifeline, His only conceivable escape hatch from total financial ruin was securing a massive corporate buyout. He truly needed a giant private equity firm to magically swoop in, purchase his worthless, over-leveraged portfolio at a high premium, and absorb all his toxic debt. He needed a miracle. And in his desperate, panicked mind, that miracle was Harrison Caldwell. My security team monitored the sheer volume of correspondence Thomas was sending to the corporate office. It was a masterclass in pathetic desperation, masked as high society networking. My father called the executive assistants 3 times a day, demanding a meeting. He sent overly familiar, groveling emails referencing their shared country club acquaintances and throwing around empty buzzwords about generational legacy and synergistic wealth building. Thomas genuinely believed he was dealing with an independent billionaire who could be charmed by a few rounds of golf and a fine cigar. He had no idea that every single email, every single frantic voicemail was being forwarded directly to my inbox for my personal amusement. While Thomas humiliated himself in the corporate arena, my sister Brittany was experiencing her own spectacular downfall in the social sphere. The financial rot infecting my father and his business had finally reached her personal credit cards. For the first time in her privileged, insulated life, her platinum cards were declining at high-end boutiques and exclusive restaurants. My team flagged several instances where she attempted to make large purchases to maintain her online illusion of wealth, only to be quietly rejected by the banking system. Instead of scaling back and facing reality, Brittany doubled down on her extreme delusion. She convinced herself that her only path to salvation was forcing a romantic connection with Harrison. She believed that if she could just manipulate him into a relationship, she would magically inherit his status and save the family from public disgrace. She sent him glossy, heavily edited photographs of herself wrapped in thinly veiled business propositions. She showed up uninvited to industry events where she thought he might be speaking, completely unaware that Harrison deliberately instructed his security detail to quietly block her from entering VIP areas. I sat there and watched all of this slowly unfold with a profound sense of cold, detached fascination. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, where the drivers were aggressively stepping on the gas pedal instead of the brakes. They were so consumed by their obsession with image and status that they could not see the massive brick wall rapidly approaching. Harrison and I coordinated our strategy with absolute surgical precision during our daily operational briefings. I instructed him to ignore their frantic advances just long enough to push Thomas to the absolute brink of total panic. I wanted my father to feel the walls closing in. I wanted him to experience the exact same feeling of helplessness and desperation he had tried to force upon me when he threatened to disown me on Christmas Eve. He needed to be fully stripped of his arrogance before the final blow was delivered. By the 3rd week of January, the pressure reached its breaking point. Thomas was formally notified by his primary lending institution that foreclosure proceedings would begin on the family estate within 30 days if the outstanding multi-million-dollar loans were not immediately satisfied. The very house where they had treated me like a worthless maid was about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The sheer terror of losing his home, his country club status, and his fake identity drove Thomas to make one final pathetic gamble. He sent a comprehensive, heavily doctored portfolio of his business assets directly to the private office via certified courier. The package included a desperate pleading letter begging for a final acquisition review. He offered to sell his entire commercial real estate empire at what he claimed was a massive discount, spinning a ridiculous narrative about wanting to pass the torch to a younger, more dynamic visionary. It was a thinly veiled plea for a corporate bailout, wrapped in the disgusting, sycophantic language of a man who knew he was completely out of options. I was sitting quietly in my boardroom when Harrison brought the physical package into my office. He dropped the heavy binder onto my glass desk with a loud thud. The expression on his face was a mixture of professional disgust and genuine amusement. "He is cooking the books," Harrison said, smoothly taking a seat across from me. "He has intentionally inflated the projected revenue of the downtown properties by at least 40%, and he completely omitted the structural liability reports for the warehouse district." If any junior analyst actually looked closely at these numbers, they would laugh him out of the building. He thinks we are stupid enough to buy a sinking ship just because it has a fresh coat of paint. I opened the binder and slowly flipped through the pages. Seeing my father and his signature on the fraudulent financial declarations filled me with a deep, resonant sense of vindication. He had always called me a failure. He had always claimed I lacked the intelligence and the drive to succeed in the real business world. Yet here he was committing blatant financial fraud just to survive another month completely unaware that his ultimate fate rested entirely in my hands. Let him think his plan is working, I instructed Harrison, tracing my finger over the inflated revenue projections. Send an official response from your office tomorrow morning. Tell him that you have personally reviewed the portfolio and that you are intrigued by the potential acquisition. Tell him you want to schedule a formal, high-stakes dinner meeting to discuss the final terms of a complete buyout. Harrison nodded, a sharp, knowing smile spreading across his face. He understood exactly what was happening. This was not just a business transaction, this was an execution. I will set the trap, he replied. I will tell him to choose his absolute best restaurant in Boston. I will make sure he believes this deal is fully guaranteed to close. The next morning, the official email was dispatched from our corporate headquarters. When Thomas received the notification that Harrison Caldwell had personally agreed to a final acquisition dinner, the reaction in Boston was predictably explosive. My security team monitored the sudden frantic surge of activity. Thomas immediately called Barbara, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated relief, declaring that their financial nightmare was finally over. He claimed he had successfully manipulated a young billionaire into saving their empire. Brittany immediately began booking emergency salon appointments, convinced that this dinner was her ultimate chance to secure Harrison as a husband. They believed they had won. They truly thought their lies, their blatant financial fraud, and their incredibly toxic manipulation had finally paid off for them. They were practically celebrating their grand victory, completely blind to the chilling reality that they were simply walking blindly into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. The stage was officially set. The key players were moving exactly as I had carefully directed them. The desperate lifeline they were reaching for was actually a tightly woven noose, and I was proudly holding the rope right in my own two hands, fully prepared to pull it tight. 2 days after the official email from my corporate headquarters landed in my father's inbox, my personal, supposedly disconnected phone began to vibrate on the marble counter of my kitchen. I had purposefully kept this specific number active, anticipating the inevitable attempt at contact. I walked over, picking up the device. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. A slow, highly satisfied smile spread across my face. They were so incredibly predictable. The arrogance that fueled their entire existence made them operate like wind-up toys. You just had to turn the key and watch them march exactly where you wanted them to go. I let it ring 3 times, establishing a slight delay to mimic the hesitation of a guilty, frightened daughter before swiping the green accept button. Hello, I answered, keeping my voice intentionally flat and subdued. Vanessa, darling. Barbara cooed through the receiver. Her tone was dripping with a thick artificial syrup that made my skin crawl. It was the exact voice she used when she wanted to manipulate a country club rival into funding one of her meaningless charity galas. I am so glad you finally decided to answer the phone. Your father and I have been worried absolutely sick about you. I took a slow sip of my coffee, marveling at the sheer unadulterated delusion. Worried sick. They had spent the last month trying to destroy my credit, attempting wire fraud, and publicly labeling me as a mentally unstable thief on social media. Yet here she was, playing the role of the benevolent, concerned matriarch. I have been busy, I replied simply, offering no apologies or explanations. I am sure you have been, Barbara said, her voice carrying a heavy, condescending sigh. Look, Vanessa. Your father and I have had some long, very difficult conversations about your recent behavior. Leaving us stranded on Christmas Eve was incredibly selfish and deeply hurtful. You completely humiliated your sister and nearly destroyed our holiday. But we are a family, and family forgives. We are willing to offer you grace. The absolute audacity of her statement was breathtaking. She was generously offering me grace for the crime of refusing to be their unpaid servant. She was framing her forgiveness as a massive unearned gift that I should be desperately grateful to receive. I remained completely silent on the line, letting the heavy, uncomfortable pause stretch out, forcing her to fill the void with her true intentions. "We have wonderful news," Barbara continued, unable to handle the silence. Her voice suddenly spiked with genuine manic excitement. "Your father has done it. He has officially secured a massive guaranteed buyout for the firm. We are closing the deal this week, and the investor is none other than Harrison Caldwell." She paused dramatically, clearly waiting for me to gasp in shock and awe. She wanted me to be completely overwhelmed by my father's supposed business brilliance. I simply bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. "That is interesting," I said mildly. "It is a triumph," Barbara corrected sharply, her true colors flashing through the fake sweetness for a split second. "Harrison personally reviewed your father's portfolio and requested a final high-stakes corporate dinner to finalize the acquisition. It is a monumental deal, Vanessa. Millions upon millions of dollars. It will completely secure the family legacy for generations to come. Brittany is also attending, of course. Harrison has been quite taken with her." The delusion was almost pathological. She was actively weaving a fairy tale where Thomas was a real estate titan, and Brittany was an irresistible prize, completely ignoring the fact that their portfolio was garbage, and Harrison had deliberately dodged my sister's frantic, desperate advances for an entire month. "I am happy for you," I said, playing the role of the defeated, submissive daughter perfectly. "Why are you calling me Mom?" Barbara let out another long, theatrical sigh. "Because your father and I believe in second chances, Vanessa. We are hosting this make-or-break corporate dinner tomorrow evening at Le Bernardin in the private dining room. It is going to be an incredibly elegant, high-pressure environment. We have decided to allow you to attend." I raised an eyebrow, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You are inviting me to the acquisition dinner. Do not misunderstand me." "Vanessa," Barbara snapped, her voice suddenly dropping an octave, turning sharp and commanding. "You are not attending as a guest. You will absolutely not be sitting at the table with us. This is a multi-million-dollar business transaction, not a casual family reunion. We cannot risk you saying something socially awkward or embarrassing us in front of a billionaire." "Then what exactly is my role?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly docile, masking the intense burning amusement building in my chest. "You will be there to assist," Barbara dictated, her arrogance returning in full force. "You will arrive an hour early to ensure the private room is set to our exact specifications. When Harrison arrives, you will stand by the door. You will take his coat. You will ensure his water glass is never empty. You will stand quietly by the wall during the negotiations and take meticulous notes. If anyone requires a document printed or a coffee refreshed, you will handle it silently and invisibly." I stared out at the sparkling Florida ocean, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of their disrespect. They were weeks away from total bankruptcy, facing foreclosure on their home, and drowning in toxic debt. Yet their absolute highest priority was finding a way to humiliate me. They wanted to use this dinner not just to secure a financial bailout, but to put me back in what they believed was my proper place. They wanted to physically break my spirit by forcing me to act as a coat check girl while they pretended to be royalty. "You want me to stand by the door and hold coats," I repeated, making sure I had heard the ridiculous demand correctly. "It is a privilege that we are even allowing you in the building," Barbara scolded fiercely. "This is your olive branch, Vanessa. This is your one and only chance to earn your way back into this family. If you do this perfectly, if you serve us without a single complaint and help ensure this deal goes smoothly, your father has agreed to stop the legal paperwork. He will not cut you out of the family trust fund. We will allow you to remain a part of our legacy." She was dangling the empty bankrupt trust fund over my head like a massive glittering prize. She actually thought the threat of losing access to their non-existent money would force me to swallow my pride and submit to public humiliation. She believed she held all the power, completely unaware that she was speaking to a woman who routinely moved billions of dollars across global markets before breakfast. And if I refuse, I asked softly, testing the limits of her delusion. Then you are dead to us forever. Barbara hissed, the venom practically dripping through the phone. You will be entirely cut off. No inheritance, no family name, no support. You will spend the rest of your life scraping by in your pathetic little property management job, knowing you threw away your only chance at redemption. Do not be stupid, Vanessa. You need us. The psychological projection was astounding. They needed me. They needed the very private equity firm I had built with my own two hands to save them from total annihilation. They were begging for my money, while simultaneously demanding that I polish their shoes. It was a level of toxic narcissism that defied all logic and reason. I took a deep, calming breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her believe I was seriously weighing the heavy consequences of my decision. I needed her to think she had won. I needed her to feel the intoxicating, arrogant rush of absolute victory. I understand, I finally said, making my voice sound small and defeated. I will be there. See that you are, Barbara replied sharply. Wear the plain black suit you wore to your uncle's funeral. Nothing flashy, nothing that draws attention. I want you completely invisible, and do not be late. She hung up the phone without another word, severing the connection with a sharp, echoing click. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the darkened screen. A massive, genuine smile broke across my face, followed by a loud, echoing laugh that filled the empty space of my penthouse. I walked back out onto the balcony, letting the warm Florida breeze wash over me as I considered the incredible irony of Barbara's demands. She demanded I wear a plain black suit, the one I wore to my uncle's funeral, a garment specifically chosen to signify mourning and submission. She wanted me to look like a shadow, an empty vessel existing solely to facilitate their greatness. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent building Apex Capital. I thought about the endless nights analyzing market trends, outmaneuvering aggressive competitors, and structuring deals that shaped entire industries. I had forged myself into a titan in a male-dominated field, yet my mother still viewed me through the lens of a subservient accessory. Her weaponization of the family trust was particularly amusing. I mentally reviewed the latest financial surveillance report my team had compiled on Thomas's accounts. The trust Barbara was threatening to withhold was currently leveraged against 3 separate commercial loans that were currently in default. The money did not even exist anymore. It had been swallowed by aggressive interest rates and compounding penalties. They were threatening me with a ghost, a phantom asset that would vanish the second their creditors initiated the formal asset seizure protocols next month. The sheer audacity of her demanding I hold coats at Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the country, was the perfect touch. Thomas was likely maxing out his last remaining lines of credit just to secure the private dining room and the tasting menu. He was burning his final financial bridge to impress Harrison, believing that this expensive dinner was the magical key that would unlock a billion-dollar bailout. I pulled up the digital acquisition file on my tablet. I looked at the grossly inflated revenue projections Thomas had submitted. He had completely fabricated the occupancy rates for his downtown properties, claiming long-term leases that my team had already proven were terminated months ago. He was walking into a federal crime by presenting these fraudulent documents to a private equity firm. He thought Harrison Caldwell was a young, naive billionaire, eager to snap up historic Boston real estate. He did not realize Harrison was a highly trained apex predator who answered to an even more ruthless boss. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the dark roast perfectly matching my mood. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for what I was about to do. For 34 years, they had suffocated me. They had mocked my ambitions, isolated me, and demanded absolute compliance. Now they were trying to force me to participate in their illegal financial deception while simultaneously humiliating me. They had crossed every conceivable boundary of parental decency. The olive branch Barbara had so generously offered was actually a poison thorn, but I was immune to their venom now. I accepted her terms because I needed to be in that room. I needed to witness the exact moment their entire false reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I needed them to look at the daughter they had treated like a maid and finally understand the magnitude of their own insignificance. The countdown to their absolute destruction had begun, and I was going to savor every single second of it. I opened a secure video channel to Harrison. He appeared on my screen, immediately sitting in his own sleek office overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The trap is fully set, he confirmed, his voice sharp and strictly professional. Thomas Preston has booked the private dining room at Le Bernardin for tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. He requested that I arrive at 7:30 to allow his family time to prepare the presentation space and go over their strategy. I nodded, a cold, predatory smile touching my lips. Perfect. Have the legal team finished the forensic audit on his portfolio? Harrison tapped his keyboard and a heavily encrypted file transferred to my screen. I just sent it over. It is actually worse than we initially thought. My junior analysts were practically laughing at the amateurish nature of the fraud. I opened the file, my eyes quickly scanning the meticulously detailed financial autopsy of my father's commercial real estate empire. The level of deception was staggering. Thomas had not just inflated his revenue projections, he had actively hidden massive environmental liabilities on 3 of his largest warehouse properties in the industrial district. He was trying to offload toxic, unsellable real estate onto my firm, hoping we would blindly absorb the devastating cleanup costs that would easily bankrupt a smaller, less diligent company. He was not just a failing businessman. He was a desperate, floundering con artist attempting a massive corporate heist just to save his own skin from the impending financial ruin he had so recklessly created. Print the entire forensic audit, I instructed Harrison, feeling a surge of pure, unadulterated anticipation. Bind it in our official corporate folders. I want the rejection letter placed on the very top, printed on heavy cardstock. I will personally hand-deliver it to him tomorrow. Harrison nodded, perfectly understanding the theatrical precision required for this execution. It will be ready for you. With the lethal documentation completely secured, I needed to solidify my cover story with my mother. I picked up my phone and composed a brief, carefully worded text message to Barbara. I have rearranged my schedule to be there tomorrow night, I typed. I will arrive early as requested to handle the final paperwork and ensure the room is set up properly. The response came through less than a minute later, radiating her usual, suffocating arrogance. See that you do, Barbara wrote. Bring a portable printer, extra ink cartridges, and presentation binders. Your father has million-dollar contracts that need to be handled with absolute care. Make sure your hands are thoroughly washed before you touch them. And remember, you are to remain completely silent, unless spoken to by me or your father. Do not look directly at Mr. Caldwell. You are there to serve, not to socialize. Do not ruin this for your sister. I read the message twice, marveling at her staggering, boundless delusion. She genuinely believed I was going to show up to an ultra-exclusive restaurant lugging a portable printer like a glorified intern. She thought the final paperwork I referenced was her husband's pathetic, fraudulent sales pitch. She had absolutely no idea that the paperwork I was actually bringing was the formal, legally binding death warrant for their entire financial existence. The poetic justice of the situation was a rich, intoxicating nectar. They wanted me to manage their documents. I was going to manage their total destruction. My mother sent one more follow-up text. Do not embarrass us, Vanessa. This is your absolute last chance. I did not bother replying. I simply locked my phone and let her enjoy her final 24 hours of imaginary supremacy. The next morning, the bright Florida sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, but my mind was already locked on the freezing streets of Boston. I ordered my private aviation team to prep the jet for an immediate departure. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet, completely ignoring the plain black morning suit my mother had so aggressively demanded I wear. She wanted me to look like a shadow, a subservient ghost fading into the wallpaper while my sister stole the spotlight. I was not going to a funeral. I was going to a corporate execution, and I was going to dress exactly like the executioner. I bypassed the subservient attire and selected a custom-tailored midnight blue power suit that cost more than my parents' current combined bank balance. The cut was sharp architectural and projected absolute unyielding authority. The fine Italian fabric caught the light with a subtle, expensive sheen that screamed old money and untouchable power. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse, subtle diamond stud earrings, and a pair of fierce stiletto heels that echoed like gunshots against my marble floor. I carefully packed the heavy leather-bound acquisition rejection file into my sleek briefcase, the golden clasp snapping shut with a satisfying note of finality. My personal driver took me directly to the private terminal without delay, and within an hour I was soaring 30,000 feet above the eastern seaboard in absolute luxury. During the flight, I did not review the files again. I did not need to. I knew every fraudulent number, every hidden liability, and every desperate lie my father had woven into his proposal. Instead, I spent the flight sipping sparkling water and looking out the window, visualizing the exact sequence of events that would unfold in that private dining room. I thought about the thousands of times my family had forced me to clean up their messes. I remembered family vacations where they flew first class, while I was relegated to economy, explicitly told that my comfort was not a priority. I remembered being ordered to scrub the kitchen top to bottom while Brittany went to the country club. They had spent my entire life casting me in the role of the help, conditioning me to believe I was unworthy of respect. Tonight, they would finally realize that the help had secretly bought the entire building they were standing in. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. There was no anxiety, no lingering fear of their disapproval, and no desperate craving for their validation. They were just bad assets waiting to be completely liquidated from my life. I recalled the bitter sting of their relentless insults, the way my father laughed at my business aspirations, and the smug satisfaction on my mother's face whenever she tore me down. Those memories no longer possessed the power to hurt me. Instead, they served as the very fuel that propelled my empire forward. I had weaponized their rejection, transforming every single doubt they cast upon me into billions of dollars in undeniable equity. My success was the ultimate shield against their toxicity. When the jet touched down in Boston, the harsh winter weather had intensified into a bitter, biting storm. The evening sky was the color of bruised iron, and the freezing wind whipped violently across the tarmac. A discreet black transport vehicle was waiting to take me directly to the luxury hotel where I would prepare for the evening. As the car navigated through the familiar snow-covered streets of my hometown, I felt a deep sense of detachment. The city that had once felt like a suffocating cage of impossible expectations now just looked like a small, insignificant dot on the map of my global empire. I was no longer the frightened daughter desperately seeking approval from people completely incapable of giving it. I was a corporate titan, returning to clear away the ruins of a toxic legacy. I checked my watch. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. In 2 hours, my family would walk into Le Bernardin, completely consumed by their desperate greed and their blind obsession with status. Brittany was undoubtedly starving herself to fit perfectly into whatever inappropriate cocktail dress she had chosen to seduce my employee. Thomas was likely standing in front of a mirror, aggressively rehearsing his fraudulent sales pitch, trying to convince himself that he was still a master of the universe. Barbara was probably finalizing her mental list of insults to hurl at me the second I walked through the door. They were all playing their pathetic, predictable roles in a script they thought they controlled entirely. They were blissfully ignorant of the fact that I had completely rewritten the ending. I stepped out of the car and into the luxurious lobby of my hotel, my briefcase gripped firmly in my hand. The final countdown to their absolute devastation had officially begun. I walked toward the private elevator, my reflection catching in the polished brass doors. The woman staring back at me was an unstoppable force of nature, ready to deliver a reality check that would echo through their lives forever. I pressed the button for my suite, my heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. It was time to go to work. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open instantly, silencing the bitter winter storm raging outside. Inside the legendary dining establishment, the atmosphere was a masterclass in hushed, intimidating luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the immaculate white tablecloths, and the soft murmur of the city elite blended with the gentle clinking of polished silver. The maitre d' stood at his podium, a paragon of discretion and gatekeeping. I approached him with my leather briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. Before I could even state my name, his professional gaze swept over my midnight blue suit. He recognized the unmistakable aura of genuine authority. I asked for the Preston private dining reservation. He bowed slightly and gestured for me to follow him through the labyrinth of elegant tables toward the secluded suites at the back of the establishment. Every step I took across the thick, sound-absorbing carpet felt like a deliberate drumbeat leading to the execution chamber. I was completely composed, my heart beating with the steady, calm rhythm of a predator about to secure its meal. The maitre d' stopped in front of a pair of heavy mahogany doors, gave another polite bow, and discreetly pulled the brass handles open for me. The private dining room was an exercise in excessive, desperate opulence. Dark wood paneled the walls, and a massive floral centerpiece dominated the long, polished table. Standing at the far end of the room, clutching crystal glasses of expensive champagne they absolutely could not afford, was my family. Thomas, Barbara, and Brittany formed a perfect, nauseating triangle of artificial confidence. My father wore a sharp tuxedo, his posture rigid and overly upright, desperately trying to project the image of an untouchable real estate tycoon. But I could see the fine sheen of nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. My mother stood beside him, draped in a deep emerald evening gown that screamed of old money pretension. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the stem of her champagne flute. Then there was Brittany. My sister had clearly spent hours and thousands of borrowed dollars transforming herself into what she believed was the ultimate prize for a billionaire CEO. She wore a skin-tight ruby-red designer dress with a plunging neckline that bordered on wildly inappropriate for a high-stakes corporate acquisition dinner. Her hair was styled into elaborate cascading waves, and she was practically vibrating with frantic, desperate energy. They were oozing a completely fabricated sense of superiority, completely blind to the fact that their financial executioner had just stepped into the room. I stepped fully into the private dining room, allowing the heavy mahogany doors to click shut behind me. The soft thud echoed loudly in the confined space, immediately drawing their collective attention. The polite, arrogant smiles plastered across their faces vanished the absolute second they registered my presence. They had expected a ghost. They had demanded a submissive broken woman shuffling into the room, wearing a plain, shapeless black morning suit, carrying a portable printer and a stack of coffee cups. They expected me to look like a desperate servant, begging for a crumb of their forgiveness. Instead, they were staring at a woman wearing a custom-tailored $5,000 power suit that radiated absolute dominance. The midnight blue Italian silk caught the ambient light of the chandelier, emphasizing the razor-sharp architectural cut of the blazer. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, holding my high-end leather briefcase with casual, intimidating ease. The pure, unadulterated shock on my mother's face was a masterpiece. Her eyes widened, darting frantically from the tips of my fierce stiletto heels to the subtle, flawless diamond studs in my ears. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, nobody in the room dared to breathe. The illusion of their absolute control over my life was suddenly and violently challenged by the sheer undeniable reality of my appearance. Barbara was the very first to recover from the initial shock, and her confusion instantly morphed into blistering, uncontrollable rage. She slammed her champagne flute down onto the polished dining table, the crystal ringing sharply against the wood. "What in God's name are you wearing, Vanessa?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with intense, poorly suppressed fury. "I gave you explicit, undeniable instructions to wear a plain black suit. I specifically told you to blend into the background. You look like you are marching into a boardroom to hostilely take over a corporation." I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I am dressed appropriately for a corporate acquisition dinner, Mother, I replied smoothly, my voice calm and completely devoid of intimidation. Thomas marched forward, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "We did not invite you here to play dress-up," he growled, lowering his voice to a menacing register so the waitstaff outside the door would not hear his meltdown. "You are here to work. Where is the portable printer? Where are the presentation binders? Harrison Caldwell is going to walk through those doors in less than 20 minutes, and you are standing here treating this crucial negotiation like a fashion show. If you ruin this deal for me because you want to act like a petulant, attention-seeking child, I will make sure you are ruined in this city. You will not be able to find a single building to manage in the entire state of Massachusetts." Brittany stepped out from behind our father, her ruby-red dress catching the light as she sneered at me with absolute unfiltered disgust. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of venom and toxic jealousy. "Oh my God, you look completely ridiculous, Vanessa," she mocked, letting out a sharp, condescending laugh that grated against my ears. "You are a glorified janitor who collects rent checks from broken-down apartments. Putting on an expensive suit does not magically make you an executive. It just makes you look like a pathetic, desperate fraud playing pretend. You think Harrison Caldwell is going to look at you and see a businesswoman? He is going to see a desperate, aging spinster trying way too hard to insert herself into a world where she absolutely does not belong." I absorbed her venomous insults without flinching, letting her incredibly fragile ego put itself on full display. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my wardrobe. I simply held my leather briefcase a fraction tighter, feeling the solid weight of the financial execution documents resting safely inside. "Take off that ridiculous jacket and go stand silently by the coat check stand right now," Brittany commanded, gesturing aggressively toward the dark, recessed corner of the private dining room near the entrance. "You are here to serve us. You are going to stand over there in the shadows, take Harrison's coat the second he walks in, and keep your mouth completely shut. If he needs a glass of water, you pour it. If he needs a pen, you hand it to him. Do not make eye contact with him. Do not speak to him. Just be invisible and do your job so I can secure my future husband and save this family." My mother stepped forward again, enforcing my sister's cruel, pathetic demands. "You heard your sister Barbara," snapped, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "Get to the wall, Vanessa, and wipe that smug, arrogant expression off your face before our guest arrives. This is the absolute last time we will ever extend an olive branch to you. If you embarrass this family tonight, you will be permanently dead to us. I will personally see to it that your trust fund access is revoked by morning." I looked at the three of them, a pathetic trio of sinking frauds desperately clinging to the very edge of total financial annihilation. They were moments away from losing their home, their country club memberships, and their entire fake identities. Their bank accounts were frozen, their creditors were circling, and their real estate empire was nothing but toxic dust. Yet their absolute highest priority was making sure I stood in the corner like a scolded, disobedient servant. They needed to force me downward to make themselves feel elevated. I did not argue. I did not correct their staggering, monumental delusions. I gave them exactly what they asked for. I offered a slow, calm nod of compliance. "As you wish," I said softly. I turned away from their gloating faces and walked gracefully toward the dark, recessed corner near the heavy mahogany doors. I positioned myself exactly where they demanded, standing tall and silent in the shadows, my briefcase resting lightly against my side. I faded perfectly into the periphery of the room, assuming the exact physical position of a subservient assistant. I watched Thomas frantically adjust his silk tie one last time, pulling down his cuffs to hide his trembling wrists. I watched Brittany reapply a thick layer of glossy red lipstick, her hands shaking slightly with nervous, desperate anticipation. I watched Barbara arrange her features into a mask of benevolent, welcoming grace, practicing her fake aristocratic smile. They were completely ready for their billionaire savior to arrive. They believed they had successfully subdued me, ensuring their grand illusion of wealth and competence would go entirely unchallenged. and I was completely ready to watch their entire world burn to the ground. The trap was flawlessly set, the bait was eagerly placed, and the executioner was patiently waiting by the door. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed softly from the hallway outside, and I knew the moment of ultimate reckoning had finally arrived. At exactly 7:30, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. The maitre d' stepped inside, bowing slightly before announcing the arrival of Mr. Harrison Caldwell. The atmospheric shift in the room was instantaneous and suffocating. The oxygen seemed to completely evaporate as my family collectively held their breath. Thomas abruptly stopped adjusting his cuffs, his spine snapping so rigidly straight I thought it might shatter. Barbara practically froze mid-sip, hastily setting her crystal champagne flute onto the table to avoid spilling it with her trembling hands. Brittany inhaled sharply, pushing her shoulders back to maximize the plunging neckline of her ruby-red dress, pasting a dazzling, entirely fabricated smile across her face. Harrison walked into the room with the commanding, effortless authority of a man who owned the world. He wore the same perfectly tailored charcoal suit he had worn in my Florida boardroom, exuding a sharp, predatory elegance that completely swallowed the artificial luxury of the restaurant. He carried the heavy leather-bound acquisition file in his left hand. The golden clasp gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. His dark, intelligent eyes immediately swept the room, taking in the massive floral centerpieces, the expensive bottles of wine, and the three desperate frauds standing at attention. He looked entirely unimpressed. Thomas did not waste a single second. Driven by sheer financial panic and the looming threat of total bankruptcy, he surged forward before Harrison had even taken 3 steps into the room. Thomas extended his right hand, thrusting it out with aggressive, sweaty desperation. He was a man drowning in a stormy ocean, reaching blindly for the only life raft in sight. "Mr. Caldwell!" Thomas boomed, utilizing his loudest, most theatrical executive voice, the same voice he used to intimidate local contractors and belittle me in our family kitchen. "What an absolute honor to finally welcome you to our table. We are thrilled you could join us this evening. I am Thomas Preston, and on behalf of the Preston family legacy, I want to express my deepest gratitude for your time. We have ordered the chef's exclusive tasting menu and selected a vintage Bordeaux that I am certain will meet your impeccable standards. Our firm is built on a foundation of excellence, and we view this meeting as the merging of two great visionary minds." Brittany immediately flanked our father, strategically positioning herself so the chandelier light would catch the glossy red of her lipstick. She stepped uncomfortably close to Harrison, invading his personal space with a sickeningly sweet, breathless laugh. She reached out, attempting to lightly touch his forearm, her eyes wide and artificially innocent. "Harrison, it is so wonderful to see you again," Brittany purred. Entirely, ignoring the fact that he had actively dodged her calls, blocked her emails, and instructed his security detail to keep her away from his public speaking engagements for an entire month. "We have all been looking forward to this evening. I took the liberty of selecting the exact chair with the best view of the room for you. Please let me show you to your seat so we can begin getting to know each other much better. I know how exhausting the corporate world can be, and tonight is all about taking care of your needs." She gestured grandly toward the head of the massive dining table, pulling out the heaviest, most ornate chair with both hands. Barbara stood a few feet away, beaming with artificial maternal pride, nodding encouragingly at her daughter's pathetic, desperate display of affection. They were throwing everything they had at him. Thomas launched directly into a heavily rehearsed, groveling pitch about generational wealth and synergistic market opportunities. He rambled endlessly about how the Preston name was a historic cornerstone of Boston commercial real estate, completely ignoring the reality that his properties were currently sitting vacant and rotting from the inside out. He spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as he desperately tried to sell the illusion of his failing empire before Harrison could sit down, open a briefcase, and look at the actual devastating math. I remained perfectly still in the dark, recessed corner of the room. My back was straight, my hands resting lightly on my leather briefcase. I watched this humiliating performance with absolute detached fascination. It was a spectacular display of corporate begging. They were completely stripping themselves of any remaining dignity, debasing themselves in front of a man they believed held the magical key to their salvation. They thought they were projecting power, but they were radiating pure, undeniable desperation. The heavy scent of my mother's expensive perfume mingled with the metallic tang of my father's nervous sweat, creating an atmosphere thick with impending doom. Harrison did not reach out to take my father's extended hand. He did not return the firm, aggressive handshake Thomas was so desperately trying to initiate. He left Thomas standing there, his hands suspended awkwardly in the empty air between them. The rejection was loud, physical, and immediately devastating. Thomas's booming executive voice faltered, trailing off into a confused, stammering silence as he slowly lowered his arm, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. The polished, confident real estate tycoon vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified old man who suddenly realized his charm was completely useless. Harrison did not look at the chair Brittany was holding out for him. He did not acknowledge her breathless, flirtatious greeting, or the hand she had tried to place on his arm. He simply stepped gracefully out of her reach, moving with the smooth, calculated precision of a predator, avoiding an annoying insect. He left her standing by the dining table with a frozen, strained smile plastered across her face, her hands gripping the back of the empty chair like a lifeline. He looked at the extravagant spread of expensive wine, the crystal glasses, and the massive floral arrangement, his expression registering mild professional disgust. He saw exactly what it was. It was a cheap, desperate bribe funded by credit cards that were about to be permanently declined by the bank. The air in the private dining room grew thick with sudden, paralyzing tension. Barbara's proud, beaming smile collapsed into a tight, nervous grimace. She took a small step backward, her emerald gown rustling softly against the carpet, her eyes darting between Harrison and Thomas in rising panic. Brittany slowly let go of the ornate dining chair, her ruby red dress suddenly looking incredibly out of place, foolish and painfully desperate. Thomas cleared his throat, a loud scraping sound in the dead silence, desperately trying to compute why his billionaire savior was completely ignoring the red carpet they had so carefully rolled out for him. Harrison turned his back on the dining table entirely. His sharp, intelligent gaze swept past the terrified faces of my parents and my sister. He looked past the extravagant floral centerpieces and the thick velvet curtains. His eyes locked directly onto the dark, recessed corner by the mahogany doors. He found the shadow they had forced me to become. Harrison walked with purposeful, measured steps, moving straight past Thomas, who shrank back slightly as the younger executive bypassed him completely. He walked past Brittany, leaving her stranded and humiliated in her desperate cocktail dress. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of me. I did not break my posture. I stood tall in my custom-tailored midnight blue power suit, the subtle diamond studs in my ears catching the ambient light. I looked Harrison right in the eyes, silently acknowledging the flawless execution of our trap. Harrison stopped just inches away from me. He did not ask for my coat. He did not ask me to pour him a glass of water or fetch him a printed document. Instead, he raised his right hand and extended the heavy, leather-bound acquisition file directly toward me. The golden clasp gleamed under the overhead lights. The thick stack of forensic financial audits rested heavily inside a physical manifestation of my family's total ruin, Boss Harrison said. The single word left his lips with absolute unwavering respect. It was not a joke. It was not a casual greeting. It was a formal, professional acknowledgement of supreme authority. The word echoed off the dark wood paneling of the private dining room, slicing through the heavy, suffocating tension like a freshly sharpened blade. I have reviewed their portfolio exactly as you asked. Harrison continued, his voice calm, clear, and projecting effortlessly across the silent room. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on mine, completely ignoring the three gasping, horrified people standing frozen behind him. The assets are severely over-leveraged, and frankly, it is a terrible investment. We strongly recommend passing on the acquisition. I reached out and took the leather-bound file from his hands. The weight of the document felt magnificent, I let my fingers brush against the golden clasp, a slow, predatory smile finally breaking across my face. I looked over Harrison's shoulder, locking my gaze directly onto my father's pale, sweating face. I watched the exact beautiful moment when his entire fabricated universe violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The silence that descended upon the private dining room was absolute and terrifying. It was not the quiet of a peaceful evening, but the suffocating, heavy stillness that immediately follows a catastrophic explosion. The air was entirely pulled from the space. The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany table. My father, my mother, and my sister stood perfectly frozen, transformed into grotesque statues of pure, unadulterated panic. They had built their entire existence on the bedrock of their perceived superiority, and that foundation had just been vaporized by a single respectful word from a billionaire. "Boss?" Thomas was the first to physically react, though his brain was clearly misfiring. His mind simply could not process the data it was receiving. The concept of his disappointing, subservient daughter holding authority over the titan of industry he was desperately begging for money was a mathematical impossibility in his universe. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. A nervous, highly unnatural laugh suddenly burst from his throat, a harsh, grating noise that echoed off the dark wood paneling. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas stammered, taking a jerky, uncoordinated step forward. His hands fluttered awkwardly in the space between us. "I believe there has been a massive, rather amusing misunderstanding here. I sincerely apologize for the confusion. This is Vanessa. She is my eldest daughter. She is not a corporate executive. She operates a very small local property management gig. We only brought her along tonight to handle the administrative tasks, to hold the coats and manage the document printing. She is essentially acting as our assistant for the evening." Barbara immediately jumped in, desperate to correct the narrative before the multi-million-dollar deal completely evaporated. Her voice was shrill, vibrating with frantic, barely contained terror. "Yes, Harrison, please forgive her," my mother pleaded, taking a step toward me with her manicured hands outstretched as if she were trying to shoo away a stray dog. "Vanessa has a terrible habit of overstepping her boundaries. She is incredibly socially awkward, and she clearly does not understand the professional protocol of a high-stakes dinner. Vanessa, stop playing this ridiculous game right now. Hand Mr. Caldwell his documents back, and go stand by the door as you were strictly instructed." Brittany added to the chorus of delusion, her face flushed with toxic jealousy and mounting embarrassment. "You are making a complete fool of yourself, Vanessa," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward Harrison to gauge his reaction. "Stop trying to pretend you are someone important. You are ruining my family's dinner. Give him the file and get out of our sight before you do permanent damage to my father's business." I did not move a single muscle. I did not hand the heavy leather-bound acquisition file back to Harrison. I held it firmly in my left hand, the golden clasp cool against my skin. I stood tall in my midnight blue power suit, projecting absolute unyielding dominance. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to shout or argue or justify my presence. I had paid an incredibly competent, highly ruthless executive millions of dollars to handle the public-facing operations of my empire, and he was about to earn every single penny of his annual compensation. Harrison slowly turned his head to look at Thomas. The expression on his face was a masterpiece of cold, professional disdain. He did not raise his voice. He did not display a single ounce of anger. He simply looked at my father the way a seasoned predator looks at a trapped, wounded animal. "There is no misunderstanding," Mr. Preston Harrison stated smoothly, his voice slicing through the frantic babble of my family like a sharpened scalpel. His tone was perfectly level, yet it carried the heavy, crushing weight of undeniable authority. "I am fully aware of exactly who this woman is. I know her name, I know her capabilities, and I know her net worth. I do not confuse administrative assistants with the people who sign my paychecks." Thomas physically recoiled as if he had been struck. The nervous, forced smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, sickening dread. "What are you talking about?" He managed to choke out his voice, dropping to a hoarse, trembling whisper. You are the chief executive officer of the private equity firm. You are the billionaire investor. We researched your corporate profile. Harrison let out a short, dismissive breath. Yes, Thomas. I am the chief executive officer. I am the public face of the operation. I sit on the boards, I handle the press releases, and I interface with desperate, over-leveraged commercial real estate developers who are begging for a financial bailout. But I do not own the firm. I am an employee. He took a deliberate step to the side, physically angling his body to direct all the focus and power in the room entirely onto me. This is Vanessa Preston Harrison, declared his voice ringing with absolute clarity. She is the sole founder, the majority shareholder, and the invisible architect of Apex Capital. She built the holding company from the ground up over the last decade. She owns the private equity firm you have been frantically emailing for the past 3 weeks. She orchestrated the billion-dollar tech acquisition we closed in Florida yesterday morning. She is not a property manager, Thomas. She is a corporate titan. I work for her. She is my boss. The silence returned, but this time it was utterly devastating. The sheer crushing magnitude of Harrison's words slammed into my family with the force of a freight train. The irrefutable truth hung in the air, a massive, unmovable reality that instantly destroyed their entire worldview. Thomas's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out and grabbed the back of a heavy mahogany dining chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. His face turned an alarming shade of gray, the blood draining completely from his cheeks. His eyes darted wildly between me and Harrison, frantically searching for a punchline, a hidden camera, any possible indicator that this was an elaborate, cruel prank. But there was no punchline. There was only the cold, hard stare of his daughter holding the exact financial documents he had doctored to save his worthless empire. Barbara looked like she had stopped breathing entirely. Her emerald evening gown suddenly looked cheap and costume-like against her rigid, terrified posture. Her hands flew to her mouth, her manicured fingers pressing against her lips, as a soft, choked gasp escaped her throat. The daughter she had relentlessly mocked, the woman she had ordered to wear a plain black morning suit and stand in the shadows, was the absolute ruler of the financial universe they were trying to break into. The realization that she had just commanded a multi-billionaire to hold coats and fetch water hit her with staggering, humiliating force. The social embarrassment was so profound, it practically radiated from her skin in visible waves. But Brittany's reaction was the most spectacular display of total systemic failure. The ruby-red dress she had purchased on maxed-out credit cards suddenly seemed like a glowing beacon of her own monumental stupidity. Her jaw literally dropped open. The realization of what she had spent the last month doing crashed down upon her. She had been aggressively, desperately trying to seduce Harrison Caldwell, believing he was her ultimate ticket to high society salvation. She had sent him inappropriate photos, stalked his public appearances, and begged him for attention, all while actively launching a toxic social media smear campaign, calling me a mentally unstable, jealous freeloader. She had just realized that the man she was trying to sleep with to save the family answered directly to the sister she was actively trying to destroy. Her entire social strategy had been an exercise in begging my employee for my money. "You are lying!" Brittany blurted out, her voice cracking with hysterical, desperate denial. She shook her head violently, her elaborate curls bouncing around her pale face. "This is impossible. It is a trick. Vanessa does not have any money. She is broke. She left our house on Christmas Eve because she is a selfish loser. She does not own a private equity firm. You are lying to us to protect her." Harrison did not even dignify her hysterical outburst with a response. He simply looked at her with an expression of profound pity, the kind of look one gives a deeply confused, misbehaving child. He turned his attention back to my father, ignoring my sister completely. "Your daughter requested that I bring the final forensic audit of your commercial real estate portfolio directly to her tonight," Harrison stated, his tone shifting back to strict business protocol. "We have thoroughly reviewed the documents you submitted, Thomas. Every single page, every projected revenue stream, and every hidden liability. She has the final authority on all acquisitions. The decision rests entirely in her hands. I slowly opened the leather-bound folder, breaking my perfect statuesque silence for the very first time since Harrison had entered the room. The sound of the heavy paper turning was deafening. I looked down at the first page of the forensic audit, then raised my eyes to meet my father's terrified, trembling gaze. "I told you I was coming tonight to handle the final paperwork, Father," I said softly. My voice was perfectly calm, devoid of any anger or malice. It was the voice of a surgeon about to make the final fatal incision. "You requested an olive branch. You demanded that I earn my way back into your family. I am simply here to do my job." The shockwave had officially leveled the playing field, completely vaporizing their arrogant illusions. The power dynamic in the room had inverted with violent, undeniable force. They were no longer the wealthy, untouchable elite talking down to the family disappointment. They were desperate, fraudulent beggars standing at the absolute mercy of the woman they had treated like a maid. The execution was ready to commence, and the blade was securely in my hand. I walked slowly past my frozen father and moved directly to the absolute head of the massive mahogany dining table. The chair Brittany had so eagerly pulled out for my employee was sitting empty. Harrison stepped forward instantly. With smooth, practiced deference, he pulled the heavy, ornate chair back for me. I took my seat, smoothing the crisp lines of my midnight blue blazer. Harrison took his place, standing immediately to my right, assuming the exact protective subordinate posture of a loyal executive directly serving his founder. The visual impact of the billionaire they had been desperately courting, acting as my personal assistant, was the final nail in the coffin of their collective sanity. I placed the heavy leather folder squarely in the center of the table and unfastened the golden clasp. The sharp click echoed loudly in the dead silence of the room. Thomas, Barbara, and Brittany remained standing near the door, clustered together like frightened, guilty children summoned to the principal's office. Their previous arrogant posturing had entirely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, undeniable terror. They were finally beginning to understand the catastrophic magnitude of their situation. "Sit down, Thomas," I commanded, not raising my voice but injecting the order with absolute unyielding authority. My father flinched. The man who had spent 34 years barking orders at me, who had slammed his fist on kitchen islands and threatened my very survival, practically scrambled to pull out a chair. He collapsed into it heavily, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. Barbara and Brittany followed suit, sinking into chairs on the opposite side of the table. They looked physically ill. The emerald gown and the ruby-red dress now just looked like cheap costumes on actors who had completely forgotten their lines. I opened the folder and extracted the first stack of documents, the executive summary of his commercial real estate portfolio. I did not look at him with anger or resentment. I looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a corporate auditor examining a particularly pathetic spreadsheet. "Let us review the paperwork you submitted to my firm." I began sliding a crisp, printed page across the polished wood toward him. "On page 4 of your prospectus, you projected a steady 85% occupancy rate for your 3 primary downtown commercial properties. You calculated your future valuation based on those long-term leases. However, my forensic acquisitions team discovered that those leases were legally terminated over 7 months ago. The buildings are currently sitting completely vacant, generating zero revenue, while accumulating massive property taxes that you have not paid since last October." Thomas opened his mouth, a pathetic, strangled sound escaping his throat. "Vanessa, I can explain the occupancy dip. The market is just transitioning, and we have verbal commitments." I held up a single finger, instantly silencing his desperate stammering. "Do not insult my intelligence by treating me like one of your gullible country club friends, Thomas. I am the majority shareholder of a firm that manages billions of dollars in global assets. You submitted falsified financial projections across state lines to a private equity firm in a deliberate attempt to secure funding under false pretenses. That is not a market transition. That is textbook federal wire fraud." The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked down at the document, his hands trembling violently. I turned to the next page in my file, the relentless rhythm of the execution continuing without a single pause. Let us move on to the environmental liabilities you conveniently omitted from your disclosure packets, I said smoothly. You attempted to sell us the warehouse district properties, listing them as prime for immediate residential redevelopment. You intentionally hid the recent municipal soil tests, confirming severe chemical contamination on the sites. The required environmental remediation alone would cost upward of $12 million, a liability you deliberately tried to dump onto my company to save yourself from bankruptcy. He stared at the table, completely unable to meet my eyes. The booming, aggressive real estate tycoon was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man facing the absolute ruin of his legacy. And then there is the matter of your personal finances. I continued, my voice remaining perfectly even and conversational. 2 days ago, my mother threatened to cut me out of the family trust fund if I did not hold coats at this dinner. She dangled my inheritance over my head like a prize. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of the folder and slid it across the table toward Barbara. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake refusing to touch it. I had my security team look into that trust fund you are so fiercely protecting, I said, staring directly into Barbara's terrified eyes. The account has a current balance of $0.00. In fact, Thomas leveraged the entire trust 6 months ago to secure a high-interest bridge loan to stop the foreclosure on the Boston estate, a loan that is currently 90 days past due. You do not have a trust fund to cut me out of, Mother. You do not even have a house. The bank is initiating formal asset seizure protocols on the 1st of the month. You are completely bankrupt. Barbara let out a sharp, devastated sob, bringing her hands up to cover her face. The flawless, aristocratic mask she had worn her entire life shattered completely. She was not a wealthy matriarch dispensing cruel judgments from a throne of old money. She was a deeply indebted, desperate woman who was weeks away from packing her belongings into cardboard boxes and vacating a foreclosed mansion. The sudden, undeniable reality of their total financial destruction broke the dam. The arrogant posturing vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, undignified begging. "Vanessa, please." Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. He leaned across the mahogany table, clasping his trembling hands together as if in prayer. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. The market shifted so rapidly, and the lenders became incredibly aggressive. I was just trying to protect our family legacy. I was trying to save the business I built. I never meant to deceive you. You are my daughter. You know I would never intentionally hurt you." The breathtaking hypocrisy of his statement was almost magnificent. He had spent his entire life intentionally hurting me. Yet the moment his survival depended on my capital, he suddenly remembered we shared the same blood. "Darling, please listen to him," Barbara cried, dropping her hands from her face. Her makeup was beginning to smear, her eyes red and frantic. "We were under so much stress. The holidays made everything so difficult, and we panicked. The things we said to you on Christmas Eve, we did not mean them. We were just projecting our financial fears. We love you, Vanessa. We have always loved you. You are our family. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot just sit there and let us lose our home. You have the power to fix all of this." I watched them beg, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound clinical detachment. They were playing the family card, wielding the very concept of loyalty they had weaponized against me for 34 years. They expected me to fall back into the role of the obedient, desperate daughter, eager to buy their conditional love with a massive corporate bailout. And then there was Brittany. My sister had remained frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the wall as the reality of her situation slowly processed in her mind. Her entire strategy for survival had just been systematically annihilated. There was no billionaire husband waiting to rescue her. The man she had been aggressively pursuing worked for the sister she had just publicly labeled a mentally unstable freeloader. Brittany suddenly burst into loud, hysterical tears. The polished, superior facade completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, utterly dependent child. She slammed her hands down on the table, her shoulders heaving with violent sobs. "I have nothing," Brittany wailed, her voice echoing shrilly in the private dining room. She looked at me, her face contorted in sheer panic. My credit cards have been declining all week. The bank called me yesterday and threatened to repossess my car. I do not have a job, Vanessa. I do not know how to do anything. If we lose the house, where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to live? She reached across the table, her manicured fingers grasping desperately at the empty air toward me. You have billions of dollars, Vanessa. I heard him say it. You have billions. You could pay off Dad's debt right now, and you would not even notice the money is missing. Please, Vanessa. I am your sister. I am sorry for what I posted online. I am sorry I called you those names. I was just stressed and scared. Please do not let them take everything away from us. You have to save us. The sound of their collective begging filled the luxurious space, a pathetic symphony of manufactured remorse and financial terror. Thomas was pleading for his fake legacy. Barbara was crying for her lost social status. Brittany was sobbing for her canceled credit cards. Not a single one of them was apologizing for how they had treated me. They were only apologizing because they had accidentally insulted the person holding the winning lottery ticket. They were looking at me with wide, desperate, expectant eyes. They truly believed that because I had the capacity to save them, I had the obligation to do so. They thought my wealth meant I would instantly revert to the role of the family savior, buying their affection and restoring their comfortable delusion. They thought the execution was over. They had absolutely no idea that I had not even delivered the final blow. I let their pathetic weeping chorus wash over me for a long, heavy moment. The sound of their collective begging was a wretched symphony of entitlement and terror. Thomas was panting, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo. Barbara was practically hyperventilating, her emerald gown trembling with each ragged breath. Brittany was a sobbing, ruined mess of smeared ruby lipstick and mascara, her hands still reaching out across the polished mahogany as if she could physically grasp the billions she had just demanded from me. They looked at me with those wide, desperate eyes, entirely convinced that the sheer magnitude of their panic would trigger some dormant, subservient instinct buried deep within my psychology. They genuinely believed that family loyalty was a magical reset button that could instantly erase 34 years of calculated, systematic abuse. I placed both of my hands flat against the cool surface of the dining table and slowly pushed my chair back. The thick restaurant carpet absorbed the sound as I stood up to my full height. I did not reach for my leather briefcase. I deliberately left the heavy leather-bound acquisition file sitting squarely in the center of the table directly between my father and me. The golden clasp caught the ambient light of the crystal chandelier one last time. I looked down at the three of them. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, nor did I feel any pity. My heart rate was perfectly steady. The emotional detachment I experienced in that moment was profound and absolute. They were no longer my parents or my sister. They were simply bad investments that I was permanently writing off. You do not seem to understand the reality of your situation? I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow resonance that instantly silenced their weeping. I am not a bank. I am not a charity. And I am certainly not the financial safety net for a family of toxic, arrogant frauds who built their entire existence on abusing me. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but the sheer icy authority radiating from my posture forced his jaw shut before he could utter a single syllable. You spent my entire life treating me like an afterthought. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, holding their terrified gazes captive. You mocked my ambitions. You tried to destroy my professional reputation. Just yesterday, you launched a coordinated, vicious campaign to ruin my credit and drag my name through the mud on social media. And tonight, you ordered me to stand in the dark corner of this room wearing a morning suit to hold your coats and fetch your water while you begged my employee for a financial bailout. You brought me here to humiliate me. You wanted to break my spirit so you could feel superior for just one more evening. Barbara let out a quiet, strangled sob, shrinking back into her chair, as if she were trying to physically disappear into the upholstery. Well, I said, leaning forward slightly, bringing my face closer to theirs. You wanted me to act like the help, so I am cleaning out the trash. The words hit them with the physical force of a sledgehammer. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, pulling her hands back from the table, as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of pure, unadulterated defeat rolling down his gray, wrinkled cheek. The absolute finality of my statement severed the last remaining thread of their delusion. On behalf of Apex Capital, I formally decline the acquisition of your commercial real estate portfolio. I declared, my voice ringing with total irrevocable finality. Your assets are toxic. Your business model is a complete failure. Your financial records are fraudulent. We will not be bailing you out, Thomas. You are going to face the foreclosure, the bankruptcy, and the absolute destruction of your fake legacy entirely on your own. Harrison stepped forward, perfectly synchronized with my command. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and withdrew a single crisp envelope bearing the embossed logo of Apex Capital. He placed it directly on top of the leather-bound folder on the table. That is the official legal rejection of your proposal, Harrison stated smoothly, his tone strictly professional and completely devoid of sympathy. The firm considers this matter permanently closed. Any further attempts to contact our executive offices will be aggressively handled by our legal department. I highly suggest you focus your remaining time on securing a competent bankruptcy attorney. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for another desperate apology. I did not stay to watch them process the crushing reality that they had just lost their home, their social status, and their entire fake identities. I simply walked away. My fierce stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood perimeter of the room, a steady, powerful beat marking my final departure from their toxic narrative. Harrison opened the heavy mahogany doors for me, bowing his head slightly as I stepped through. I did not look over my shoulder. The suffocating atmosphere of the private dining room vanished the second I crossed the threshold, instantly replaced by the warm, lively hum of the restaurant main dining floor. I walked through the elegant establishment with my head held high, radiating the untouchable confidence of a woman who had just conquered her past. The maitre d' offered a deep, respectful bow as I approached the front entrance. I stepped out into the freezing Boston winter storm, but the bitter wind felt incredibly refreshing. A sleek black transport vehicle was already waiting at the curb to take me back to my hotel. I slid into the warm, plush interior of the car, leaving Harrison to handle the restaurant bill. I wanted my family to walk out of that private room completely empty-handed, knowing my employee had paid for the extravagant dinner they tried to use as a weapon. The retaliation from my family was immediate, frantic, and utterly useless. By the time I boarded my private jet the following morning to return to Florida, my phone was besieged by a barrage of unhinged text messages and voicemails. Thomas alternated between screaming, empty threats of legal action and sobbing pleas for a personal loan. Barbara sent dozens of voice notes begging for forgiveness, blaming Thomas for the financial ruin, and trying to leverage the memory of my childhood to guilt me into compliance. Brittany completely unraveled, sending venomous, hateful messages cursing my existence, before immediately pivoting to pathetic demands for me to pay off her credit cards. I did not listen to a single voicemail. I did not read a single text message. I handed my device directly to my lead security director, David, the exact moment I stepped into my Palm Beach penthouse. Execute the final blackout protocol, I instructed him, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. I want a strict ironclad no-contact order enforced across all personal and corporate channels immediately. Within 24 hours, my elite legal team dispatched formal cease and desist orders to Thomas, Barbara, and Brittany via certified courier. The documents explicitly outlined the severe legal and financial consequences they would immediately face if they ever attempted to contact me, approach my properties, or publicly mention my name or my corporate entities again. My security team permanently blocked their phone numbers, email addresses, and IP locations from accessing any of my personal or business networks. They were entirely permanently erased from my digital and physical existence. The fallout in Boston proceeded exactly as the financial mathematics predicted. 30 days after the disastrous dinner at Le Bernardin, the primary lending institution officially initiated the foreclosure on the family estate. The sprawling colonial property that had served as the fortress of their arrogance was seized and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Thomas was forced to declare total catastrophic bankruptcy, completely dissolving the commercial real estate firm he had used to terrorize me. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed in the middle of the night. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues. Brittany was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, her fraudulent social media empire collapsing the second she could no longer afford the aesthetic of the Boston elite. They lost absolutely everything. I did not shed a single tear for their downfall. I did not feel a trace of survivor guilt. They had meticulously engineered their own destruction through decades of cruelty, arrogance, and financial incompetence. I simply allowed the natural consequences of their actions to finally catch up to them. 6 months later, I sat in the expansive sun-drenched boardroom of my Palm Beach headquarters. The massive mahogany table was covered in fresh acquisition proposals, international market analyses, and operational expansion blueprints for the tech portfolio Harrison was currently running with ruthless efficiency. The air in the room was charged with the electric, exhilarating energy of pure, unadulterated success. Apex Capital was projecting record-breaking profits for the third consecutive quarter, and my operational footprint was expanding globally. I stood up and walked over to the sprawling glass windows, looking out at the sparkling turquoise water of the marina below. The harsh, freezing winters of my past felt like a lifetime away. I had spent 34 years trapped in a toxic cage, relentlessly conditioned to believe I was a disappointment, a servant, an invisible entity, meant only to absorb their abuse. But the fire they had tried to extinguish had instead forged me into solid steel. I raised my espresso cup to my lips, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the dark roast coffee. I was the founder. I was the majority shareholder. I was the boss. I had completely shattered the illusion of their superiority and reclaimed the absolute authority over my own life. I looked out at the boundless, beautiful horizon stretching across the ocean, a brilliant smile breaking across my face. I was entirely free, and my empire was just beginning to rise.